The coffee's already on. That is the first thing you notice. Not the grey light coming through the window above the sink, not the particular stillness of a house that has not yet woken up, not even the smell of the gas range clicking on a few minutes ago when no one else was stirring. It is the coffee. The particular smell of it moving through a kitchen in 1943, rich and real and there before anything else is ready to be there. A woman is moving through this kitchen, quietly. She knows every corner of it in the dark. She knows which floorboard speaks and which ones stay quiet. She knows exactly how far to turn the burner so the coffee simmers and does not boil. She knows this kitchen the way you know a thing you've tended for years, not by thinking, but by having been there enough times that your body simply knows. The rest of the house is still sleeping. She is not. She never is. If you enjoy listening to sleep stories like this, subscribe. I post stories like this weekly. I want to take you somewhere very specific before we go anywhere else. Not to a battlefield or a factory or a government office. Though all of those things matter in the story we're telling. I want to take you to a house. A particular kind of house, in a particular decade, on a street that you might have walked down without giving it much thought. It is an American house in 1943, and I want you to feel it rather than simply picture it. The house is probably not large. In the cities and their suburbs, the working and middle-class homes of wartime America were built to a modest template. 2 bedrooms, sometimes 3, a front room and a back room, a kitchen positioned at the rear where the work of the house happened, a small bathroom if the family was fortunate, and a basement that was not quite finished but was deeply useful. In the south, the layout shifted slightly, a screened porch rather than a vestibule, different windows, a different relationship between inside and outside. In the Midwest, the houses sat closer to the ground and reached up rather than out. On the coasts, the lots were tighter, the neighbours closer, the noise of other people's lives a constant low hum. But across all of these variations, certain things stayed the same. The kitchen was the centre. The kitchen was always the centre. Think about what that means for a moment. In a house without a great room, or an open floor plan, or a living space designed around a television that does not yet exist, the kitchen is not just where food is made. It is where the family gathers in the morning because that is where the warmth is. It is where the news is processed. The radio in the corner, the newspaper folded on the table, because that is where the day begins. It is where decisions are made, or at least where the conditions for decisions are set. What is in the icebox? What the ration book will allow this week? Whether there is enough flour for biscuits or whether the flour needs to last until next Tuesday. The gas range sits against one wall and I want to linger on it for a moment, because it is the true heir of something very old. Before the gas range there was the wood stove. Before the wood stove there was the hearth. Open fire, iron crane, the whole ancient relationship between a family and the flame that kept it alive. The gas range broke that relationship and remade it. The fire was still there, you could still see it burning in low blue rings beneath the pot, but it was controlled now. It was manageable. You turned a knob and there was fire. You turned it back and the fire was gone. You did not have to feed it. You did not have to tend it through the night. It did not threaten the house the way an open hearth could threaten a house. And yet, stand in a 1943 kitchen when the range is on, and tell me it is not still the centre of everything. The warmth radiates outward from it in a particular way. Steady, reliable, domestic. The smell that comes from it is the smell of the household in its most purposeful mode. Not the ceremonial smell of a special meal, not the Sunday best version of the kitchen, but the every morning smell of a place that is doing what it was built to do, keeping people fed, keeping people going. The icebox, and in 1943 it was still often an actual icebox, a heavy insulated cabinet that held a block of ice delivered by the iceman twice a week, though by the early 40s electric refrigerators were making their way into more homes. The icebox sat on the opposite wall or in the corner where the floor was easiest to mop. It was not as central as the range. It was a repository, a holding place. The range was active, the icebox was patient. Between them, the kitchen table. I want you to think about what that table carried in the 1940s. Not just the food, though it carried plenty of that, 3 meals a day, every day, for however many people the family held. It carried the ration book, its pages of blue and red stamps carefully managed and never wasted. It carried the newspaper, folded to the war news, and sometimes folded away from the war news because the children were eating and you did not want them to see what was happening in the Pacific today. It carried letters, sometimes letters with military postmarks, sometimes just the ordinary correspondence of a life being lived. A note from your sister in Ohio, a bill from the dentist, a church circular about the scrap drive on Saturday. It carried the mending basket in the evenings, because the light was better in the kitchen than in the front room, and because the kitchen was warm and the front room was not always warm in February. The table was where the woman of this house spent a significant portion of every day of every year of the 1940s, and I want you to feel the weight of that before we go further. Not as a sad thing, not as a diminished thing, but as a real thing, a specific and important thing, the way the deck of a ship is a real and important thing to the person who stands on it for years and knows every plank and every rope and exactly where the horizon sits when the weather is about to change. Now walk through the rest of the house. The front room, it might have been called the living room or the parlour depending on the decade it was built and the formality of the family, was where the family appeared to the world. This room had the good furniture. The sofa with the crocheted antimacassars on the arms, slightly fussy, positioned just so. The radio cabinet, which in the early 40s was still a piece of furniture rather than an appliance. A wooden box on legs with a fabric-covered speaker, and a dial that glowed amber in the dark. The family photographs on the side table, and in 1943 very possibly a new addition. The small flag in the window with the blue star on it, or more than one, or one that had been changed from blue to gold. I will come back to those flags. I'm not ready to talk about them yet. The bedrooms were upstairs, or in a ranch-style house, at the back of the hall. They were practical rooms, not designed for comfort so much as function. A bed, a dresser, a washstand or a small vanity if the woman of the house had managed to claim one. The children's room, which in working-class homes was very often shared. 2 or 3 children in a room, a bunk or 2 single beds pushed against opposite walls, a single shared closet. The particular organised chaos of children's belongings in a space that was never quite large enough. In a well-run household, and the households we are talking about were very often well-run, in the specific and demanding way that limited resources require, even the children's room had a certain discipline to it. Shoes by the door, coat on the hook, nothing wasted, nothing left where it would cause trouble. The basement, if the house had one, was a working space. The wringer washer, heavy utilitarian requiring real strength and attention to operate, stood against one wall. The laundry lines strung across the ceiling or running out to the backyard were the artery system of the household's textile life. The basement also held the furnace, which a woman might well be managing herself if her husband was overseas, a task that required its own knowledge, its own seasonal rhythms, its own relationship with the particular temperament of a particular piece of equipment. And behind the house, in nearly every American neighbourhood of the 1940s, the Victory Garden. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let us stay here for a moment, in this house, in 1943, and simply notice it. What strikes me, looking at the 1940s American house, in all its modest specificity, is how much it asked of the person who ran it. Not in the way we sometimes think when we say a house asks things of you, the way we mean when we talk about the emotional labour of domestic life, the management of relationships and schedules, and the invisible architecture of family well-being. That was real too. But I mean something simpler and more physical than that. The house asked for maintenance that was not optional. The coal or oil or gas furnace needed tending. The wringer washer needed operation and attention. The icebox needed drainage. The range needed cleaning. The windows needed blackout curtains in some cities and towns, pulled down at dusk so that the light inside did not offer guidance to aircraft that had no business flying over American cities, and the women of the home pulled those curtains, checked them, and took the responsibility of that small act of civil defence seriously in a way that a person who has never felt a genuine threat cannot quite imagine. The 1940s house was not a convenience, it was a responsibility, and the woman who ran it, who knew its systems and its rhythms and its requirements, the way a ship's engineer knows an engine room, carried that responsibility every hour of every day, alongside everything else she was carrying. Here is a detail I keep returning to because it grounds everything that follows. In 1943, the United States had been at war for a little under 2 years, and the specific texture of civilian domestic life had already shifted in ways that are difficult to fully describe to someone who has only ever lived in peacetime. The shifts were not primarily dramatic. Though there were dramatic moments, there were terrible moments. The shifts were mostly small and cumulative. The shape of the grocery list changed. The categories of possible and impossible rearranged themselves quietly without announcement. You could not buy new tyres for the car. You could not buy nylon stockings. You could buy sugar, but not as much as you used to. And you held the ration book carefully because mid-month, if you had not been careful, you would be eating your oatmeal without sugar and no one would be happy about it. These small and cumulative shifts, managed day after day in the kitchen and the basement and the Victory Garden, were the fabric of the 1940s home, and the woman who managed them, who absorbed them, adapted to them, and found ways to maintain the quality of ordinary life inside them, was doing something that deserves considerably more credit than it has ever been given. I do not say this to be sorrowful, or to make this into something heavy. I say it because I want you to feel the specific weight of what ordinariness costs when ordinariness is hard to maintain. The table set for dinner, every night, even when dinner is olio on bread, and a soup made from last week's ham bone. The beds made every morning, even when the woman who made them got less than 6 hours of sleep. The front room dusted, the laundry done, the children fed and sent to school in clean clothes. All of it maintained with a steadiness that is not performance and is not instinct. It is work. It is knowledge. It is the practiced skill of someone who has learned by necessity how to keep a world functioning. The house, in other words, was not background. It was the story. Have you ever walked through an old house, a house built in the 30s or 40s, and felt something? Not just the nostalgia of old materials and old proportions, though that is real. Something else. Something about the smallness of the rooms and the particular way the windows sit and the heaviness of the doors. I think what you are feeling, or part of what you are feeling, is the evidence of a life that was lived at close quarters with itself. A life where proximity and utility were the organizing principles rather than comfort and spectacle. A life where the kitchen was not designed to be photographed, but to be used daily, hard and well. That life produced something. We will spend this entire story trying to say what it was, but for now stay here, in the kitchen. Coffee on, range warm. The rest of the house still sleeping. The morning has not yet arrived, but it is very nearly here. There is a particular quality to the hour before the rest of a household wakes up. I think most people who have experienced it know what I mean without my having to describe it. A stillness that is not empty, a quiet that is not absence. It is the most useful hour of the day, and for the woman managing a 1940s American household, it was not a luxury. It was a strategy. She was up before 6, very often before 5:30. The exact time depended on what the day held, and how many people needed to be dispatched toward it, how many children needed feeding and dressing, whether there was war work or volunteer work or church work on the schedule, alongside the daily work of the house, whether the laundry needed to go on early, or whether the Victory Garden needed attention before the heat of the day settled in. But the principle was constant. You got up before the house got up, because the hour when no one needed anything from you was the hour when you could think. Think is perhaps not quite the right word. Plan might be closer, or simply move. Move through the kitchen in a particular sequence that had been refined over years, until it operated almost without conscious attention. Coffee first, range lit. A mental inventory of what the morning would require and what supplies the inventory would draw from, and what substitutions the ration book's current state demanded. All of this happening in the soft grey light before dawn, in a kitchen that was just beginning to warm. I find myself moved by the image of this, and I want to be honest about why. It is not sentiment, or not only sentiment, it is something more specific than that. The woman moving through the kitchen at 5:30 in 1943 was performing a kind of daily reconstruction of the world. The house had gone to sleep in whatever condition the previous day had left it. Dishes done or not, laundry folded or waiting, the next day's plans settled or still uncertain. And she was, in that first hour, putting it back together, restoring it to its functional shape. Not for herself, mostly. For the people who would wake up into it. That reconstruction, I think, is the thing that gets lost when we talk about domestic labour in this period. We talk about the tasks, the cooking, the cleaning, the sewing, the canning, and the tasks were real and demanding. But the deeper thing, the thing underneath the tasks, was this daily act of making a functioning world out of whatever the world had provided. And in 1943, what the world had provided was complicated. Let us get specific about what those early mornings actually contained. By 1943, roughly 12 million American men had entered military service, and the households they had left behind were being managed in most cases by the women they had left. Not all of those women were at home. The wartime labour shortage had drawn millions of women into factory work and office work, and other forms of employment outside the house. Rosie the Riveter was a real figure, though she was many figures, not one. But the domestic work still needed doing. The children still needed feeding. The house still needed running. For women who had taken on war work outside the home, the early morning was not a quiet hour of preparation. It was the only hour available to do what had previously been a full-time job. The Office of Price Administration, the OPA, had established the rationing system in 1942, and by 1943 it governed a remarkable range of household goods. Sugar had been rationed since May of 1942, the first item restricted, because so much of the sugar supply came from the Philippines and Hawaii, and the Pacific War had disrupted that supply chain catastrophically. Coffee was rationed, meat was rationed, butter was rationed, canned goods were rationed, shoes were rationed, 1 pair per person per year. Gasoline was rationed, though this mattered more for some households than others depending on geography and transportation habits. The ration book itself was a physical object of considerable importance in the household, and I want you to picture it. It was a small booklet, roughly the size of a pocket notebook, with pages of perforated stamps in 2 colours. Blue stamps governed processed foods, canned goods, certain frozen foods, the newly important category of dried goods. Red stamps governed meat, dairy, fats, and fish. Each stamp had a point value, and each eligible food item had a point value, and the household's monthly allocation of stamps had to stretch across every meal the household would eat. The woman doing the early morning planning in 1943 had this book memorised, not in the way you memorise a poem or a phone number, as an external piece of information that you hold in your head, in the way you memorise your own house, intuitively, physically, as a condition of living inside it. She knew how many red stamps were left. She knew the point value of the round steak she was considering for Sunday and how it compared to the chicken that was technically more expensive but used fewer stamps. She knew the substitutions that worked and the ones that did not, that oleo spread on warm bread was acceptable to the children if you did not make a production of the fact that it was not butter, but that oleo in a pie crust was a different matter entirely. This knowledge was not trivial. It was the practical intelligence of a logistician operating under real constraints with real consequences if the planning failed. Running out of red stamps by the 3rd week of the month was not an inconvenience, in the way that running out of something today might be an inconvenience, something you replace with a quick trip to the store. It was a material problem. It meant the week's remaining meals needed to be built from what was not rationed, and not everything that was not rationed was interesting or nutritious or easy to cook. The USDA and the OPA had both produced guidance, distributed through newspapers and radio programs, and the women's magazines that were among the most widely read publications in America, about how to feed a family on wartime rations. The guidance was cheerful and practical, and sometimes almost comically optimistic. But it was also, embedded inside its cheerfulness, genuinely useful. Home economists employed by the government had spent real time working out which combinations of available ingredients would produce meals that were nutritious and filling and not actively dispiriting. The recipes that showed up in Good Housekeeping and Better Homes and Gardens and the weekly food pages of the local newspaper were not random. They were the result of actual testing, actual adjustment, actual consideration of what a family could be persuaded to eat repeatedly without revolt. Back to the early morning. The coffee percolates on the range, and the sound of it, that particular rising bubble, is part of the morning's texture, not the coffee maker's sound of today, the brief efficient gurgle of a machine doing its job in 90 seconds. The percolator worked slowly, the water cycling up through the basket, the coffee darkening gradually, the smell building over several minutes into the full rich presence that could wake you from a sound sleep 2 rooms away. There is a piece of writing from this period, a column in a Midwestern newspaper, written by a woman whose name I have not been able to recover, published in the spring of 1943, that describes exactly this hour. The writer talks about what she calls the planning minutes, the time between starting the coffee and the time the children would begin to stir. She describes moving through the icebox. Hers was still an actual icebox, the electric model was still beyond her budget, mentally assembling the day's meals from what she found there. She describes the particular satisfaction of looking at her canning shelf, the rows of jars put up the previous summer, and calculating how many meals remained in them. She uses a phrase I've thought about many times since I found it. She calls the planning minutes the truest part of the morning, because they were the part that nobody witnessed and nobody thanked her for. They were just hers. I think that phrase carries something important. The truest part of the morning. The part that nobody thanked her for. There is no bitterness in it. The columnist was not writing a manifesto. She was writing about her own life with the clarity that comes from paying close attention. But she was noting, quietly and without elaboration, that a significant portion of what kept her household running was invisible. It happened before anyone was there to see it. It was the infrastructure beneath the day rather than the day itself. The children would wake at different times depending on age and temperament. The youngest first. This was the near-universal experience of mothers in this period, as in all periods, calling out from their room or appearing at the kitchen doorway with the particular stunned expression of a small child not yet fully awake. Then the older ones, in sequence, in the particular rhythm that each household developed over years, until it became as natural as breathing. Breakfast in 1943 was governed by the same constraints as every other meal, with the additional complication that it needed to be produced quickly, at a time when the adults in the household were not fully functional, and the children were in the specific chaotic state between sleep and readiness that makes them difficult to manage. Oatmeal was common because oats were not rationed, and oatmeal was filling and warm, and could be made in a pot while other morning tasks were in progress. Eggs were valuable, rationed not directly but effectively since farm families had their own supply and urban families did not. And when eggs appeared on a weekday morning breakfast plate, they represented a small extravagance. Toast was universal. The bread, often homemade, sliced and toasted in the oven or on a wire rack over a burner because electric toasters, while not impossible to obtain, were not universal. Butter or oleo. Coffee for the adults. Milk for the children, though this too was subject to shortages in some areas and had to be stretched sometimes. The whole operation, from the first coffee to the last child sent out the door, was perhaps 2 hours. 2 hours of continuous coordinated activity that required the simultaneous management of multiple timelines, multiple needs, multiple small crises of the domestic variety. The missing shoe, the shirt that needed a button replaced 5 minutes before the school bell, the older child's complaint about the breakfast repeated until it became something more than a complaint and needed to be addressed with a kind of patient firmness that is its own exhausting skill. And then they were gone, and then the real work of the day began. I want to ask you something, and I mean this as a genuine question, not a rhetorical one. When was the last time you did something at full capacity before most people were awake, without anyone watching, without anyone thanking you, and then did it again the next morning and the morning after that? Not because you had to get to a flight, not because you had a particular project due, simply as the daily condition of being responsible for a household and the people inside it. The women we are talking about did this for years, for the duration of the war and through the years of adjustment that followed. They did it in houses that were not always warm and kitchens that were not always stocked, and with supplies that were not always what the recipe called for. They did it while managing the specific weight of not knowing whether the person who used to do this with them, or for whom they were doing it, was all right. They did it while reading the news and not letting the news appear on their faces at the breakfast table. The early morning, in other words, was not just a practical interval. It was a daily act of will, a choice made before full consciousness to make the world function, to set the conditions for a day that would be ordinary enough for the people inside it, to hold, in that first quiet hour, everything that needed holding. I do not think we have a word adequate to what that is. Competence is too cold, devotion is too soft. Endurance suggests suffering, and it was not primarily that. It was something more active than endurance, something closer to craft in the way we use that word when we mean a knowledge so deep and practiced that it operates partly beneath language. The knowledge of the sea that a sailor carries in their body, the knowledge of stone that a mason knows in their hands, the knowledge of a household, the knowledge of what it needs and when and how and at what cost and from what limited supply of energy and patience and love and time. The knowledge that was acquired before anyone was watching, maintained without witnesses, and expressed every morning in a kitchen in 1943 while the coffee percolated on the gas range and the day waited to begin. The light is changing now. The grey is softening towards something that will be yellow, eventually, somewhere around 7 when the sun clears the houses across the street. A child's voice from upstairs. The morning is beginning. She puts down her cup, straightens, and begins. There is a story that gets told about wartime rationing in America, a cheerful, patriotic story about ordinary people pulling together, accepting minor inconveniences for the greater good, and discovering in the process a kind of resourceful creativity that made them stronger. That story is not wrong. The solidarity was real. The creativity was genuine. The pride that a family felt in managing on less than they were used to, in contributing through sacrifice to something larger than themselves, was not manufactured. But the inconvenience was not minor. I want to be careful here, because I do not want to overstate the difficulty or make the 1940s housewife into a figure of tragedy. She was not a tragic figure. She was, by most evidence, a remarkably capable and often remarkably cheerful one. But I also want to be honest about what rationing actually meant, in the daily and specific and physical terms of feeding a family, because the cheerful story sometimes obscures the genuine difficulty of the undertaking. Let us start with the point system, because understanding it is essential to understanding what the woman managing a household was actually doing every day. The OPA's point system worked like this. Each household received a ration book with a monthly allocation of stamps. Blue stamps, formerly printed with letters and surrounded by blue ink, governed processed and canned foods. Red stamps governed meat, fish, dairy, and fats. Each eligible food item at the grocery store had a point value assigned by the OPA, and that value could change from week to week as supply conditions shifted. A can of tomatoes might cost 8 blue points this week and 10 next week. A pound of hamburger might cost 7 red points in March and 12 in April if beef was scarce. This variability was not random. It was the government's mechanism for managing demand. If a particular food item was in short supply, its point value went up, making consumers use more of their scarce stamps to buy it, and thus suppressing demand. If supply improved, the point value came down. It was, in a sense, a second price system operating alongside the dollar price. You had to afford something in 2 currencies simultaneously, and one of those currencies was strictly limited and could not be replaced once spent. The woman shopping for her household had to navigate this dual currency system every time she went to the grocery store, which was typically 2 or 3 times a week. She needed to know not just what things cost in dollars, but what they cost in stamps. And she needed to do this arithmetic quickly, at the counter, while the grocer waited and possibly other customers waited behind her. She needed to do it while also keeping track of how many stamps of each colour remained in the household's book for the rest of the month, and while factoring in what was already in the icebox and what was on the canning shelf, and what the family would realistically eat versus what she could theoretically make from the ingredients available. This is not simple grocery shopping, this is logistics. The women's magazines of the period, Woman's Day, Ladies' Home Journal, Good Housekeeping, McCall's, ran weekly and sometimes daily features on wartime cooking, and reading them now is a fascinating exercise in practical problem solving. The editors and home economists who wrote these features were not condescending toward their readers. They assumed correctly that the women reading them were intelligent and capable and already doing their best. What the features offered was the specific knowledge that the best required, the exact point values of specific cuts of meat, the substitution ratios for butter replaced with oleo or lard or Crisco, the techniques for stretching a small amount of protein into a meal that felt substantial and complete. One technique that appeared in magazine after magazine and cookbook after cookbook was the concept of the extender. You took a small amount of rationed protein, a half pound of ground beef say, or a single chicken leg, and you extended it with breadcrumbs, cooked oatmeal, chopped vegetables, or other fillers that added volume and some nutrition without requiring additional stamps. The resulting dish might be a meatloaf, or a hash, or a casserole, all forms whose fundamental purpose is to spread a limited ingredient across a larger meal. The meatloaf, I want to say, deserves a moment of serious attention. It has become in the decades since the 1940s a thing of mild comedy, a symbol of the worst of mid-century American cooking, dense and grey and uninspired. But the meatloaf of the 1940s was a genuine technical achievement. It was the solution to a real problem. How do you make a pound of ground beef feed 6 people in a way that is nutritious and satisfying and does not feel like poverty? You mix it with a cup of breadcrumbs soaked in milk. You add an egg if you have one. You add onion and salt and whatever seasoning the pantry holds. You compress it into a loaf shape and you bake it slowly until it holds together, and you slice it and serve it with gravy made from the pan drippings, and the dinner is, in fact, a dinner. It is not a gourmet dinner, but it is a real dinner, and it fed millions of American families during the war years, and the woman who made it had solved a genuine logistical problem with skill and knowledge and a certain amount of love. Let me tell you about oleo. Oleomargarine, which we now simply call margarine, was the wartime substitute for butter, and its arrival in the American household was not seamless. Butter was rationed at £0.25 per person per week, which sounds like perhaps enough until you consider that in 1943, butter was still the primary cooking fat for baking, frying, saucing and spreading. £0.25 per person per week across a household of 4 was £1 of butter for 7 days of cooking and eating, and £1 of butter is not enough for 7 days of cooking and eating if butter is your primary fat. Oleo filled the gap, but it came with its own complications. It was white. Dairy industry lobbying had successfully argued that coloured margarine would unfairly compete with butter, and in most states it was illegal to sell margarine pre-coloured yellow. So oleo arrived at the grocery store as a pale, waxy white block accompanied by a capsule of yellow food colouring. The buyer was expected to mix the colouring into the oleo at home, kneading it through the block until the colour was uniform and the result looked more or less like butter. This was a task that fell to whoever was in the kitchen, which was usually the woman of the house, though children were often recruited to help with the kneading. It took several minutes and considerable physical effort. It was one of those tasks of the 1940s household that has no equivalent today, a small and slightly absurd piece of labour that was nevertheless entirely real and entirely necessary if you wanted your bread to look like something other than axle grease. The taste of oleo was different from butter. Not terrible, the food scientists who developed it were not indifferent to the question, but different. Slightly flatter, slightly less rich, with a texture that behaved somewhat differently in cooking. Women who cooked with it daily developed adjustments, a bit more salt in the biscuits, a different technique for creaming it with sugar and cake batter, a learned tolerance for its particular flavour in pie crust. These adjustments were small and they accumulated into a kind of expertise, a working knowledge of an ingredient that no cookbook had fully documented because the ingredient was new. Sugar rationing created a different but equally complex set of challenges. Sugar was the first item to be rationed in 1942, and its absence reorganised the dessert landscape of the American household. Saccharin, synthetic sweetener, was available but not universally appealing and not suitable for all baking applications. Corn syrup, honey and molasses were not rationed and could partially substitute for sugar in some recipes but not others. The women who made the cakes and cookies and pies that their families had come to expect worked through every available combination, testing and adjusting, and the results were sometimes genuinely excellent and sometimes clearly makeshift and sometimes impossible to tell apart from the real thing until you had the real thing again years later. Here is something I find genuinely interesting about the wartime kitchen. The constraints that the rationing system imposed did not suppress creativity. They provoked it. When the straightforward answer, buy more, use more, was unavailable, the woman managing the household was forced to think laterally, to substitute, to improvise, to find the solution that was 3 steps removed from the obvious one. And in the doing of it, she developed a relationship with her ingredients and her techniques that went considerably deeper than the relationship you develop when abundance makes everything easy. The Victory Cookbook, published in 1942, and the USDA's various wartime nutrition guides were not aspirational documents. They were working tools, dog-eared and stained in the households that used them, annotated in the margins with substitutions that had worked, and notes about proportions that needed adjusting. The knowledge embedded in those annotations, the particular intelligence of a woman who had tried a recipe and improved it, and noted the improvement for future use, is one of the forms of wisdom the 1940s kitchen produced that never got its proper accounting. I want to stay with this for another moment because I think it matters. We tend to think of cooking knowledge as something acquired casually, through pleasure and leisure, and the agreeable process of trying new things in a well-stocked kitchen. And that kind of cooking knowledge is real and valuable. But it's a different thing from the cooking knowledge that is acquired through constraint, through the necessity of making something good from what is available, not from what you would prefer. Constraint-based cooking knowledge is deeper and more transferable. It is the knowledge of principles rather than recipes. You learn why a dish works, what function each ingredient performs, when you are forced to find substitutes for ingredients that are not available. You learn the architecture of a meal rather than just its surface. The women who fed American families through 4 years of rationing came out the other side with this kind of knowledge, and many of them kept it for the rest of their lives. You can sometimes hear it in how they talked about food, if you were lucky enough to know someone who had cooked through the 40s. A certain specificity about why a recipe works, a certain confidence with improvisation, a certain skepticism about the necessity of exotic ingredients when the basic ones, handled well, are sufficient. These are not the habits of someone who was defeated by the constraints of the 40s. They are the habits of someone who was forged by them. Let me describe a dinner, 1943, a Tuesday in early October. The household has a husband overseas, 2 children aged 7 and 9, and a weekly budget that was always adequate before the war and is somewhat less adequate now. The woman of the house has planned this dinner around what the ration book allows at this point in the month, and what is on the canning shelf and what the neighbourhood grocery had in stock this morning. There is a pot of vegetable soup on the back burner, made from a ham bone that has been simmering since morning, with canned tomatoes, 3 blue stamps, dried navy beans from the pantry, not rationed, carrots from the Victory Garden, not rationed, and whatever other vegetables were available. The soup is substantial now, thickened by the beans, fragrant with the ham bone's work, and it will be the centre of the meal. On the table there is bread, homemade, 2 loaves baked yesterday, 1 already mostly gone, and olio in a small dish. There is a small plate of canned beets from the canning shelf, opened this morning, arranged as a side dish that the children will eat without complaint, because beets have a sweetness to them that translates well to children if you do not make a production of what they are. The soup and the bread and the beets will feed 4 people, and the 4 people will leave the table full. The woman who made this meal spent perhaps 40 minutes in active preparation, plus the several hours the soup was on the back burner untended. She did not use any red stamps because the ham bone was already in the house, from the Sunday ham that had gone into sandwiches on Monday. She used 3 blue stamps for the tomatoes. The rest came from what was grown or stored or simply kept. This is not hardship cooking, or rather, it is, but it is hardship cooking practiced with skill, and the distinction matters. Hardship cooking without skill produces something edible. Hardship cooking with skill produces something nourishing and real, something that a family can eat together at table in October 1943 and feel, for the duration of that meal, that life is functioning normally. I am not proposing that we glamorize scarcity, or suggest that ration books are something anyone would choose over abundance. They are not. What I am saying is that the women who managed those ration books, who worked within their constraints with intelligence and persistence, and a genuine commitment to feeding their families well, were doing something that deserves serious recognition as a skill, not just as virtue or patriotism or duty, though it was all of those things, as skill, as craft, as competence of a high order. The full table made from almost nothing. That phrase, the pride of it, is where I keep arriving when I read the women's accounts of this period. Not the pride of self-denial, not the pride of sacrifice, the pride of having solved the problem, of having looked at what was available and produced from it something that worked. The cook's pride, the maker's pride, the specific satisfaction of a problem that was real and difficult, and is now, at least for tonight, solved. There is something in that worth carrying. Go out the back door, there, behind the house, in the rectangle of ground that was grass or weeds before 1941, and is something quite different now. That is where part of the household's resilience lives. The Victory Garden was one of the most successful civilian mobilization campaigns of the Second World War, and its success rested almost entirely on the labour and knowledge of the women who planted and tended and harvested it. By 1944, the Department of Agriculture estimated that Victory Gardens in the United States were producing approximately 40% of the vegetables consumed by American families. 40%. Grown in backyards and vacant lots and front yards and rooftops and every available patch of urban, suburban, and rural soil that could be coaxed into productivity. The campaign to promote victory gardening was a government effort, coordinated through the USDA, promoted through every available media channel including radio, newspapers, magazines, and the vast distributed network of local garden clubs, extension services, and neighborhood organizations. The message was simple and consistent. Growing your own food frees up commercially grown produce for the troops and for Lend-Lease shipments to allied nations. Your garden is a weapon. That framing, the garden as weapon, the domestic act as military contribution, was deliberate and by most evidence effective. Women who might otherwise have felt that the work of maintaining a household was peripheral to the war effort were given a specific and measurable way to understand their contribution. Every jar of beans you put up this summer is a jar that the government's supply chain does not need to provide. Every pound of tomatoes you grow and can is a pound that can go to the troops. You're not waiting for the war to end. You're fighting it, from your backyard, with a trowel. I do not want to be cynical about this framing because the domestic work it mobilized was genuinely consequential. But I also want to notice that it was mobilizing something that already existed, the knowledge and capacity for productive gardening that many American women, particularly those from farming backgrounds or with European immigrant heritage, already possessed. The Victory Garden campaign did not create that knowledge. It organized it, validated it, and gave it a patriotic sanction. What was already being done quietly and practically was now being done loudly and publicly, with government approval and neighborhood recognition. The soil to begin there, because beginning anywhere else misses the foundation. Working a victory garden required an understanding of the particular soil you'd been given, which in most backyards was not the rich, loose, well-composted soil of a farm field, but something considerably less promising. Compacted clay, or sandy loam, or the depleted former turf of a suburban yard that had never been asked to produce anything except grass. The work of making that soil productive, turning it, amending it with whatever organic matter was available, managing its moisture and its drainage, was the first and most fundamental of the garden's demands. The compost pile, which in wartime America was not just a convenience but a genuine resource, processed the household's organic waste, vegetable peelings, coffee grounds, eggshells, garden debris, into the amendment that the soil needed. Managing a compost pile is a skill in itself, one that requires an understanding of the balance between carbon-rich materials and nitrogen-rich ones, between moisture and aeration, between what the pile needs and what the household produces. Women who kept good compost piles were not following a casual instinct. They were managing a biological system that rewarded attention and punished neglect. The planting calendar mattered enormously. In the Northeast, you could not plant tomatoes outside before late May or early June without risking frost damage. In the South, the summer heat limited what would grow in July and August and required fall plantings, timed precisely. In the Midwest, the short growing season made succession planting new seeds every 2 or 3 weeks so that the harvest stretched rather than arriving all at once, essential to getting maximum production from a limited space. The vegetables that appeared most commonly in victory gardens were chosen for their productivity and versatility. Tomatoes, beans, peas, carrots, beets, lettuce, kale, Swiss chard, cucumbers, squash, corn where space permitted. Some of these were familiar and beloved. Others, kale in particular, which had been a European working-class staple but was not deeply embedded in American middle-class cooking before the war, became familiar through necessity and remained in pantries and gardens long after the war ended. The tomato deserves particular attention, because in the context of the victory garden and the canning shelf it was something approaching a miracle crop. A single healthy tomato plant in a productive season could yield 20, 30, even 40 pounds of fruit. 20 pounds of tomatoes could produce, depending on the canning method and jar size, 15 to 20 quarts of canned tomatoes. 20 quarts of canned tomatoes could carry a family through a winter's worth of soups and stews and sauces and casseroles. From one plant, 20 to 40 times the initial investment returned as preserved food. Multiply that across the 8 or 10 or 15 tomato plants in a productive victory garden, and you begin to understand why the canning shelf was not just a food storage area. It was a form of wealth. The canning shelf, let me describe it properly. In most 1940s households, it was in the basement, cool, dark, and stable in temperature, which was exactly what preserved food needed. The shelves might be rough-cut lumber on brackets, or the original shelving that came with the house, or something improvised from whatever wood was available. On those shelves, by mid-autumn in a productive year, stood the rows of jars. In the 1940s, canning was done primarily in glass mason or ball jars with two-piece lids, a flat metal disc with a rubberized seal, and a metal ring to hold it down during processing. The jars were reusable from year to year if the lids were replaced. They came in quart and pint sizes, and experienced canners knew which size was appropriate for which food. Quarts for tomatoes and beans and corn, intended for large family meals. Pints for pickles and relishes and jams, intended for smaller quantities. The jar itself, properly sealed with the satisfying downward concavity of the lid that indicated a good vacuum, was the unit of the household's food security. You counted your jars the way a ship's captain counts provisions before a voyage. How many did we put up this year? Is it enough? The canning process itself was not simple. Water bath canning, the method appropriate for high-acid foods like tomatoes, pickles, and jams, required a large pot, a rack to hold the jars off the bottom, and careful attention to timing. Pressure canning, required for low-acid vegetables like beans, corn, and beets, because low-acid foods can harbour botulism if not processed at temperatures above boiling, required a pressure canner, a specialised piece of equipment with a weighted gauge or a dial gauge that had to be checked for accuracy at the start of each canning season. The pressure canner's hiss. I think about that sound often, for reasons I find difficult to fully articulate. It is the sound of the canning process working correctly. The steam venting at the right pressure, the temperature inside the canner sufficient to kill any dangerous bacteria, the food inside the sealed jars being processed safely. It is a domestic sound, entirely ordinary in its context, and it is also in its way the sound of survival, of preparation, of a household doing what it needed to do to get through the winter on its own terms. Botulism was a real concern and not merely a theoretical one. Improperly canned low-acid vegetables could harbour Clostridium botulinum, the bacterium that produces botulinum toxin, and the toxin is odourless and colourless and extraordinarily dangerous. Women who canned took this seriously. Extension Service publications and USDA bulletins on home canning were explicit and detailed about safe techniques, and the women who used them were not casual about the instructions. You processed your green beans for the right time at the right pressure, every time, because the consequences of carelessness were severe. This attention to safety in the canning process is itself worth noting. It required the canner to take the chemistry of food preservation seriously, to understand in practical terms why the pressure and the time both mattered, to maintain the discipline of following the process correctly, even when it was time-consuming and the day was long. This is not the kind of knowledge that announces itself. It is quiet and technical and entirely functional. It kept people safe. The women who canned well canned a great deal. In a productive year, a canning shelf might hold 100, 150, 200 jars of preserved food. Tomatoes in their various forms, whole, stewed, in sauce, green beans, corn, beets, pickles of various kinds, jellies and jams from whatever fruit was available, strawberries in June, wild berries in July, peaches in August, apples through the fall, apple butter in the large crock transferred into jars and sealed, relish, piccalilli, bread and butter pickles. Looking at this canning shelf in October, with the season's work preserved behind glass and the winter ahead looking manageable, you understand what the women's accounts mean when they describe it as a kind of satisfaction. Not smugness, satisfaction. The specific and deep satisfaction of a thing done right, of a season's labour made visible and permanent and useful. This is what the summer produced. This is what the household has earned. This is what the children will eat this winter. There is an accounting quality to the canning shelf that I find quite beautiful. The work is not invisible here. It cannot be invisible. It stands on the shelves in glass, labelled and dated in the canner's handwriting, a physical record of the effort that produced it. You cannot look at 50 quarts of tomatoes and pretend they got there on their own. The victory garden required physical labour that is worth registering honestly. Turning soil with a spade is hard work. Weeding in August heat is hard work. Carrying full bushel baskets from the garden to the kitchen is hard work. And then the canning itself, standing over a hot stove in the same August heat, managing a pressure canner for hours at a stretch, processing jar after jar in the production schedule that the harvest imposed, was hard work in a way that the December beneficiary of the canning shelf might not fully appreciate when she opens a quart of tomatoes in February. But here is the thing about this work that I want to say carefully. It was satisfying in a specific way that purely consumptive activities are not. There is something about producing food, growing it, harvesting it, preserving it, being able to point to a shelf full of jars and say, "I did that. My family will eat because of that." That connects to something deep and real in human experience. The hunter-gatherer in us, maybe. The part that was designed to understand abundance in terms of what was produced rather than what was purchased. I do not want to romanticize subsistence. The women who grew and canned their own food would have been delighted to buy what they needed from a well-stocked grocery store with no rationing and no point system. They were not gardening as a lifestyle choice or a therapeutic activity. They were doing it because it was necessary and because they knew how. But necessity and knowledge are not incompatible with satisfaction. You can know something is hard and do it anyway and feel good about having done it well. The victory garden and the canning shelf were hard, and the women who maintained them were good at it, and the goodness mattered to them in a way that simple patriotism does not fully explain. There is also this. The victory garden was a place of genuine pleasure in a world with a shortage of ordinary pleasures. Going out in the early morning before the heat settled to check what had happened overnight in the garden, which beans had produced, whether the tomatoes were coming ripe, whether the corn was high enough, was not a grim task. It was a daily small discovery, a kind of narrative that unfolded in real time and was almost always at least partly good news. The garden grew whether the war news was good or bad. The tomatoes did not care what was happening in the Pacific. They simply needed water and sun and a little attention, and in return they gave back abundantly, faithfully, according to their own unhurried calendar. In a period when so much was uncertain and so much was outside any individual's control, the garden's faithfulness was not nothing. It was a form of stability, small-scale, domestic, entirely non-heroic, but real. The neighbourhood in 1943 was not simply a geographic fact. It was a functioning social system, and the women who inhabited it were its primary architects. I want to be precise about what I mean by this, because it is easy to let the phrase social system sound abstract when what it actually describes is something concrete and daily, and entirely practical. The neighbourhood of the 1940s was a network of mutual aid, information exchange, resource sharing, and collective responsibility that operated largely through the agency of the women who were present in it during the day when the men, if they were home at all, were at work or at war. Let me describe the neighbourhood as it functioned. On any given weekday morning in a 1943 residential neighbourhood, the women were there. The streets were not empty. There were tradespeople and delivery men and the occasional man too old or too medically exempt for service, but the dominant social presence during daylight hours was female. Women walking to the grocery store, women working in their victory gardens, women hanging laundry on the lines that stretched across nearly every backyard, women moving between houses with plates of food or borrowed cups of flour, or the daily intelligence about which store had received a delivery worth going to, and which was out of what. This daily movement, this constant low-level exchange of information and goods and labour, was the neighbourhood's nervous system, and it was highly organised, even though it did not look organised from the outside. It looked like ordinary domestic activity. It looked like women going about their days. What it actually was a distributed logistics operation, sophisticated in its own way, with its own protocols and hierarchies and forms of knowledge. The block captain, a role formalised through the civil defence programmes but also existing informally in most neighbourhoods, regardless of official structure, was typically a woman. Her job was to know her block. Who lived where, who needed what resources each household had to offer, who was struggling and might not say so. She was the first point of contact for civil defence information, air raid drill schedules, scrap drive collections, and the various government programmes that reached civilian households through neighbourhood channels. She was also, less formally but just as importantly, the person who knew when a family 2 doors down had not been seen in a few days and might need checking on. The Red Cross chapters that organised throughout the war depended on women volunteers for essentially all of their daily operation. This was not peculiar to the Red Cross. The entire volunteer infrastructure of wartime America, from USO canteens to blood drives to the massive knitting campaigns that produced millions of socks and scarves and sweaters for troops, ran on female labour. Women organised the drives, staffed the booths, managed the accounting, coordinated the distribution, and maintained the paperwork that kept the whole apparatus functioning. This volunteer work was not incidental to the women who did it. In a period when women with children at home were not in most cases going to war plants, the wartime female workforce was heavily weighted toward younger women and women without young children. The volunteer work was the channel through which the impulse to contribute found expression. It was the way that the woman managing her household and her victory garden and her ration book could be part of the larger effort rather than simply supporting it from a distance. And it was real work. The women who staffed the Red Cross canteens were not decorative. They were managing the production and distribution of food and comfort items to enormous numbers of servicemen, operating at volumes that required genuine organizational skill. The women who ran the bond drives were managing volunteer sales forces, keeping records, coordinating with banks and with the Treasury Department's program offices, hitting targets that represented real money. The women who collected scrap, tin cans, rubber, cooking fat, old tires, were managing the logistics of a materials recovery system that fed directly into the war's industrial supply chain. The fat collection program deserves a specific mention because it is one of the more surprising details of wartime domestic mobilization, and because it is so entirely of its moment that it is almost impossible to imagine in any other context. Cooking fat, the rendered drippings from bacon and other meats that most American households saved as a matter of ordinary thrift, was a genuine war material. Animal fat was used in the production of glycerin, which was an ingredient in explosives. The government's appeal to housewives to save their cooking fat and turn it in at collection points was not symbolic. It was a material request for a material that the war industry needed. Women complied. Bacon drippings saved in coffee cans turned in at the neighborhood butcher shop, who served as the collection point in most communities, and passed up the supply chain toward the factories that processed them. A pound of fat yielded enough glycerin to produce a pound of explosives. The numbers were small by industrial standards. The national collection was not making or breaking the war's material requirements. But the fact that it was organized, that the appeal was made and heard and acted upon by millions of households across the country, says something important about the relationship between the domestic world and the war effort. The collection drives generally, tin, rubber, paper, fat, were organized and run at the neighborhood level by the women who knew the neighborhood. They knew which households had large stores of cans and which had already given everything available. They knew who the holdouts were, the households that were not participating and needed either convincing or social pressure, applied gently but persistently. They knew the collection schedule and the drop-off logistics and who had a car that could pick up larger contributions. This knowledge and this organizational capacity were not accidents. They were the accumulated product of years of neighborhood involvement. The church committees, the school PTAs, the garden clubs, the neighborhood improvement associations that had been the training ground for this exactly. The women who managed the wartime neighborhood drives had been managing civic organizations for years. The wartime context was new. The skills were not. I want to talk about the woman next door, not a specific woman, a type, or more accurately a relationship. The woman next door in 1943 was not simply a neighbor in the geographic sense. She was, in most neighborhoods, something closer to a colleague, a partner in the daily management of domestic life who happened to live in the adjacent house. The relationship was not always warm. Neighborhoods had their tensions, their old grievances, their incompatibilities of personality. But even in neighborhoods where individual relationships were complicated, the practical interdependence of households was real. You borrowed sugar from her when yours ran low mid-month, and you returned it or you didn't if her supply was also low, and in either case you both survived the situation. You watched each other's children when the other was at the grocery store or the Red Cross chapter. You shared information about which butcher had gotten a shipment worth going to, and which was out of everything useful. You compared what you had put up on your canning shelves and what you still needed, and sometimes an exchange was arranged. Your surplus pickles for her surplus beans, because your family liked pickles but did not like beans, and hers was the reverse. This exchange economy was not trivial. It operated beneath the formal economy of the rationing system, and alongside it, extending the household's effective supply beyond what the ration book alone provided. It worked on trust and reciprocity, and the management of those trust relationships, knowing who was reliable, who could be counted on, who needed more help than they were getting, was itself a form of knowledge that the woman who was present in the neighborhood all day possessed in ways that no official program could replicate. There is an element of this that I think gets lost in how we tend to talk about women's wartime experience. We talk about Rosie the Riveter, the woman who stepped into the factory, who crossed the boundary between domestic and public life, who demonstrated by her presence in the workforce that women could do what had previously been considered men's work. And this is a real and important story. The wartime workforce transformation had long-term consequences for women's economic position that continued to unfold for decades. But the story of the women who were not Rosie, who remained in the neighbourhood, managing the domestic infrastructure that made the factory work possible, is also real and also important, and it tends to get considerably less attention. The woman at home was not passive. She was managing a complex logistical operation. She was contributing materially to the war effort through the victory garden and the scrap drives and the bond purchases and the fat collection and the volunteer work. She was maintaining the neighbourhood's social fabric and its mutual support systems, and she was doing all of this while also managing the emotional weight of having someone she loved in a dangerous place. Her contribution was not lesser because it was domestic. It was different, and in some ways more difficult, because it required her to hold everything together by herself in the absence of the person who had shared that work with her before. The neighbourhood was where that holding together happened. The woman next door who could be talked to over the fence while the laundry dried. The woman down the street who had also received a troubling letter, or no letter at all this week, and understood the particular quality of that anxiety without needing it explained. The morning walk to the grocery store where the conversation was about what was available, and also about everything else. The letters and the boys and the news and how long do you think it will be? This was the neighbourhood's most important function. Not the scrap drives, not the bond sales. The fact that you were not alone in it. The war created a specific form of solidarity among women that I think has rarely been adequately described. It was not the solidarity of the picket line or the march or the dramatic collective act. It was quieter and more domestic than that. It was the solidarity of women who were all managing the same impossible situation, keeping a household and a family running in the absence of the person who had shared that work, in the context of a war whose outcome was uncertain and whose duration was unknown, and who were doing it in proximity to one another, in full view of one another's daily lives, with the particular intimacy that comes from knowing someone in their ordinary domestic reality, rather than in any more formal or public context. I know that my neighbour's husband is overseas because I have seen her through her kitchen window, making dinner alone. I know that she has not slept well because she says so when we meet at the fence. I know that she's managing better than she sometimes suggests because her victory garden is producing, and her children are clean, and her house is maintained, and all of this visible evidence tells me that she is in fact all right, and she knows the same about me, and the knowing in both directions is a form of comfort that does not require words. The neighbourhood, in other words, was watching out for itself. Not officially, not as a program or a policy, as the natural expression of people who were in it together, who knew that they were in it together, and who chose, daily, in small and unannounced ways, to act accordingly. There is a letter on the counter. It arrived this morning, or perhaps yesterday, or perhaps last week. The envelope is thin, V-mail, the photographically reduced version of overseas correspondence that the military postal service had introduced to save shipping weight, and the handwriting on it is familiar in the way that makes your heart do something complicated before you have even opened it. You know that handwriting. You have known it for years. The letter is there on the counter and you have not opened it yet because once you open it you will know what is in it, and not knowing is a kind of holding, a keeping of the moment before the knowing. Not because you expect bad news, or not only because of that, but because the letter, unopened, is still entirely possible. It could say anything. He could be well. He could be somewhere safe. He could say he will be coming home soon and mean it. Once you open it, the possibilities collapse into what is actually there. This is the specific psychology of waiting. I want to try to describe it accurately because I think it is one of the most important and least understood dimensions of what the 1940s housewife carried. V-mail was introduced in 1942 as a solution to the logistical problem of moving enormous volumes of personal mail between the American mainland and the overseas theatres of the war. The process worked like this. The letter writer wrote on a special V-mail form, a single sheet designed for the purpose. The completed form was photographed onto microfilm at a collection point. The microfilm was shipped overseas or to the States, taking a fraction of the space the original paper would have required, and at the receiving end it was printed onto photographic paper at a reduced size, typically about 4 inches by 5 inches. The recipient got a tiny, somewhat blurry reproduction of the original letter rather than the original itself. This process meant several things that mattered to the women waiting at home. It meant that the letters they received were not quite the same as the letters that had been written. The handwriting was legible but small. The intimacy of the original paper, the fact of its having been physically touched by the person who wrote it, was gone, replaced by a photographic reproduction that was technically efficient and humanly somewhat sterile. It also meant that letters could be censored at any stage of the process. The original form before photographing, or the photographic reproduction at the receiving end. And they were. Anything that might give military intelligence to the enemy, location, unit, movements, conditions, was cut out or blocked, and the resulting letter had holes in it, literal white spaces where information had been removed that the reader had to work around. The woman at home reading a censored V-mail letter was reading a document that had been edited by people whose criteria for what to remove were not hers. A reference to a place she could picture him in, cut. A mention of a fellow soldier whose name she recognized, cut. Sometimes the cuts were extensive enough that the remaining text was fragmentary, and she had to reconstruct from the fragments what the whole letter had contained. She became, in other words, a reader skilled in inference. She learned to read what was there for what was missing. A letter that mentioned the heat, but not the location, told her something. A letter that asked specifically about the garden, in detail, when he had never been particularly interested in the garden before the war, told her something too, that he was reaching for the ordinary, that he was homesick for the specific textures of the daily life he had left, that the garden and the kitchen and the children's homework and even the neighbour's dog were more present to him in whatever he was going through than any of it had probably seemed before. She answered these letters. This is something that is easy to forget in the larger story of the war. The correspondence was reciprocal. For every letter from overseas there was a letter home, and writing that letter, the letter home, was its own complex task. What do you tell someone who's in the middle of a war about the life they left behind? What is helpful to share and what is a burden? How do you write honestly about how things are? The difficulties, the loneliness, the particular heaviness of managing everything alone, without adding to his worry, when he has things to worry about that make your difficulties seem small. Women navigated this constantly, in letters that were not written once and finished, but with the ongoing text of a relationship being maintained across enormous distance under difficult conditions. They learned to write toward the ordinary, toward the specific and daily rather than the dramatic, because the ordinary was what he was missing and what would eventually be home again. They wrote about the victory garden and the children's school and the neighbours' news and the radio programmes and the small daily events of a life continuing in his absence. They did not write, in most cases, about how frightened they were. They wrote around it. This skill, the skill of communicating care and connection and ordinary life while managing what you do not say, is not nothing. It is a form of emotional discipline that takes years of practice to develop, and the women of this period developed it by necessity, in letters written at the kitchen table late at night when the children were in bed and the house was quiet and there was enough privacy to feel clearly what you were not going to say. The gold star flag in the window. I've been moving toward this and I will not avoid it. A blue star flag indicated a family member in active military service. Many families had them, hanging in the front window or displayed on a small banner beside the door. In a neighbourhood at war, you might see blue star flags on every third or fourth house on a block, sometimes more. In some neighbourhoods, they were nearly universal. The flags were a statement of participation, a visible declaration that this household too had someone in the war, that this family was part of it. A gold star meant that the blue star soldier was not coming home. The gold star flags were not common. They could not be common in a neighbourhood that was functioning, but they were present. And their presence, quiet and specific in the window of a house you had passed 100 times, was one of the most difficult things about living in a neighbourhood at war. Not just because of what it represented for the family inside, but because it brought the war's reality into the domestic space in a way that was impossible to look away from. There is a letter, real, found in a collection at an archive, from a woman in Ohio, written to her sister in 1944. She mentions, almost in passing, that the family down the street has changed their blue star flag to gold. She does not elaborate. She does not explain the significance, because her sister knows the significance as well as she does. She just says it, and then moves on to the next paragraph about the children, and the movement from one to the other is itself a description of what this period was like. The catastrophe and the ordinary life proceeding simultaneously, side by side, with no resolution between them, managing fear in front of the children. This is perhaps the most demanding invisible skill in the 1940s housewife's repertoire. Children are perceptive, and they are also fundamentally dependent on their caregiver's emotional stability in ways that create a specific kind of responsibility. A child who senses her mother's fear about her father becomes frightened in her own way, with her own version of the anxiety she's not equipped to fully understand or process. A mother who cannot manage her own fear in her child's presence is not failing in a moral sense. She is simply doing the best she can with the extraordinary weight she has been given. But many mothers in this period did manage it, or tried to, daily, imperfectly, with the specific determination of someone who understands that the attempt matters, even if perfection is impossible. What did that management look like? It looked like keeping the routines intact, dinner at the regular time even when you were not hungry, school clothes laid out the night before the same as always, the regular bedtime, the regular story, the regular kiss on the forehead, the radio program at the regular hour, the same program you always listened to together, the victory garden weeded on the regular day. These routines were not performative, they were structural, the bones of a daily life that could hold the children steady even when the bones were the only thing holding the adults steady too. It looked like answering the questions simply and directly. When our children ask where Daddy is, the truthful answer, he is in the Pacific, he is far away, he is fighting, is also the right one, because children who are not told the truth fill the silence with their own imaginations, and their own imaginations are almost always worse than the truth. But the delivery of the truth needed calibration. Told with anxiety, the truth becomes frightening. Told steadily, the same truth is information, manageable, something that fits into a child's understanding of the world without breaking it. It looked like finding the right books and activities. The war was present in children's culture of the period, in the movies and the comic books and the school activities that were organized around the war effort, and navigating which of this culture was reassuring and which was overstimulating required attention and judgment. And it looked sometimes like simple privacy. The woman who went to the bathroom and sat on the edge of the tub for a few minutes and let herself feel what she actually felt before washing her face and going back out. The particular discipline of emotion, management that requires an occasional private release so that the managed emotion does not build until it becomes unmanageable. This too was skill, or something that looks like skill when you see it practiced consistently over years. There is a particular silence I want to describe. The silence of a household on a morning when the newspaper is on the table and the news is bad. Not bad about your own soldier specifically, bad about the war generally. A major offensive gone wrong, casualties in a theatre where you know his unit is operating. A report of a battle with a number attached to it that is large and specific. That silence is different from ordinary morning quiet. It has weight to it. The children feel it even if they cannot name it. The woman managing the household feels it from the inside where it is heaviest, and then she makes the oatmeal. Not because the oatmeal matters more than the news, because the oatmeal is something she can do, because the children will eat and will go to school and will have the ordinary day that she is working to provide for them, and that ordinary day is itself a form of the answer to the weight of the bad news, not an argument against it, not a denial, just also this, also breakfast, also school, also the daily texture of a life that continues and is worth continuing. I am not proposing this as a philosophy. I am describing what happened in millions of kitchens in a particular period of American history. The war at a distance was managed daily by the people who had the most at stake and the least control, and their management of it was one of the most quietly impressive things the American home front produced. There is a patience at the centre of good parenting that I do not think we talk about honestly enough. Not patience as a virtue of temperament. The gentle, naturally calm person who is simply constitutionally suited to being around children. That kind of patience exists, but it is relatively rare, and it is not really what I mean. I mean the patience that is not temperamental but practiced, the patience of someone who has learned, through experience and necessity, and the repeated failure of impatience to produce anything useful, to slow down to the speed of a child. The 1940s mother had this patience in the specific and demanded form that wartime required. Children are not interested in convenience. They are interested in their own rhythms, their own concerns, their own perception of what matters and what does not, and their perception does not map well onto an adult's perception, and particularly not onto the perception of an adult who is managing a household alone, managing rationing and gardening and volunteer work, and the ongoing project of not visibly falling apart. Children want to talk at length about matters of no consequence, when the matter of consequence is pressing. They want to slow down precisely when the schedule requires speed. They ask why at exactly the moment when the answer would take longer to give than the situation allows, and they need to be met where they are. Not always, not perfectly. No parent then or now meets their children where they are every time, but often enough to keep the relationship functional and the child grounded, often enough that the child's interior world is not a mystery to the person responsible for it. The 1940s mother met her children in the middle of everything else she was doing. The mending while she listened to the day's account, the bread making while she answered the questions, the dinner preparation interrupted by the crisis of the scraped knee, or the failed arithmetic, or the argument with the sibling that required adjudication. This simultaneous management of tasks and children, doing the physical work of the household while also being emotionally present for the small humans who inhabited it, was not described as multitasking in 1943 because that word did not yet exist. But the practice was universal, and the skill required by it was real. Creativity without resources. Let me think about this specific phrase for a moment, because it describes something that the 1940s domestic world produced in quantities that are difficult to quantify, but easy to recognize once you start looking. Consider the problem of keeping children occupied. In 1943 there was no television, there were no video games, there were movies, but movies were an occasional event rather than a daily option, and they cost money that many households could not easily spare for entertainment. There was the radio, which children listened to with genuine enthusiasm, the serials, the adventure programs, the dramatic shows that engaged a child's imagination in ways that passive visual media cannot quite replicate. But the radio could not substitute for the entirety of a child's need for activity and stimulation and play. What filled that space was the family's own resources, and primarily the creativity of the woman managing it. Paper and crayons for the young children, in an era when paper was a rationed material and crayons were a modest but real expenditure. Games invented from available materials, the classic American childhood games of the period, most of which required nothing but bodies and an outdoor space or a set of rules agreed upon and maintained by the children themselves. Reading, which was aggressively promoted as both educational and entertaining by every institutional channel available, and which had the additional advantage of requiring no supplies once the books or library cards were in hand. The public library, whose importance in this period cannot be overstated, free books, free space, a place that was warm in winter and cool in summer, and available to any child who wanted to be there. For older children, the war itself became educational material of a specific and immediate kind. Following the news, tracking the progress of the campaigns on the maps that newspapers printed regularly, understanding the geography and the politics of a conflict that had reached into their own household, these were not abstract school subjects. They were personal, and the woman who helped her children understand them was doing genuine educational work, even if it was not recognized as such. The household crafts that had been women's work for generations found a new context and a new generation of learners in the 1940s household. Sewing, knitting, mending, all of these were skills that wartime conditions made practically necessary rather than optional, and many girls learned them earlier and more thoroughly than they would have in peacetime because the need was real, and the teacher, the woman managing the household, was present and capable and understood the value of passing the knowledge on. Knitting, in particular, had been elevated to the status of patriotic activity through the Red Cross campaigns that asked American women to knit garments for servicemen and civilians in war-torn countries. Millions of women and girls took up knitting who had not previously known how or who had let the skill lapse, and the result was a population-level increase in knitting competence that had nothing to do with fashion or trend and everything to do with a genuine collective effort to clothe people in need. A child who learned to knit in 1943 was learning a skill with an immediate and meaningful application. There is something clarifying about that, about learning a thing because the thing matters now, because there is a real person at the end of the yarn whose feet are cold. I want to talk about what it meant to be the emotional centre of a household when the emotional centre, the other parent, the co-manager, the person who shared the weight, had been sent away. The phrase holding the emotional centre is not mine. It appears in various forms in a range of sources from this period, in advice columns, in letters, in the memoirs that some of these women eventually wrote when they were old enough to look back with some distance. What they mean by it is not simply keeping the family's morale up, though that is part of it. They mean something more structural than that. They mean being the person to whom the household's emotional reality was anchored. Being the stable point around which the lives of the children and the household functioned, even when that stable point was experiencing its own instability. This is one of the hardest things a person can be required to do, not because stability is inherently difficult to maintain under normal conditions. Most people are capable of being reasonably stable when life is not actively difficult. But because maintaining the appearance and the substance of stability when you are frightened, or exhausted, or lonely, or angry at the situation you're in and cannot do anything about, maintaining it not just for one bad day but for months, for years, as the indefinite condition of your existence, requires a kind of sustained effort that wears at the edges of the self. The women who managed this, and most of them, by all evidence, did manage it, did not do it because they were naturally without needs or naturally indefatigable. They did it because they understood that the household needed someone to hold it together, and they were the one who was there. The patience under pressure, the creativity without resources, the daily decision to be the functional centre of a family when you do not feel like the centre of anything. These are not small things. They do not make headlines, and they do not appear on any military service record or in any list of wartime heroes. But they are real, and they were widespread, and they produced children who grew up knowing, whether they could articulate it or not, that someone had made the world work for them when it easily could have stopped working. There is something that I want to say carefully about the relationship between these women and their children, because I think it is one of the things that the 1940s domestic world produced that had lasting consequences. The children who grew up in households managed by these women, in the conditions of wartime and its immediate aftermath, grew up inside a particular understanding of how the world worked. They grew up knowing that resources were finite and must be managed. They grew up knowing that work was a daily condition rather than a special circumstance. They grew up knowing that a family's stability was not given, but produced, through daily sustained effort by someone who chose to make it so. They grew up, and this may be the most important thing, knowing that a person could manage very difficult things without being broken by them. Not everyone who grew up in the 1940s absorbed these lessons cleanly or equally. Childhood is complicated, and the adults around it are human, and the transmission of values and knowledge is never perfect. But the environment in which these children developed was shaped by these realities, and that shaping was real. The woman standing in the kitchen at the end of a long day, listening to the homework being done at the table, making the dinner, holding the space for all of it. She was not just feeding children. She was, in the most basic and literal sense, raising them, teaching them by example what it looks like to manage difficulty with competence and consistency, teaching them that work is not shameful, and that resourcefulness is not poverty, and that a full table made from very little is something to be proud of. These are lessons that the post-war decades spent considerable energy unlearning, in ways that we are still sorting through, but they were real, and the woman who taught them, in kitchens and victory gardens and neighbourhood networks and the long slog of wartime and its aftermath, was doing something worth understanding fully. The day has a shape, and the shape is long. By the time the evening hours arrived in a 1943 household, the day had been going for 12 or 14 hours. Not 14 hours of continuous demanding activity. There were moments of rest within the day, pauses, the particular rhythm of physical labour and task completion that operates differently from the sustained concentration of office or factory work. But the waking hours had been full, and the fullness had cost something. The question the evening posed was, what remains after everything the day has taken? The answer in most cases was, enough, not extravagantly, not in the way of a person who has had an easy day and comes to the evening with reserves intact. in the way of someone who has learned to pace the day's expenditure so that the evening is not empty of capacity, even if it is not abundant with it. The dishes still needed washing, the mending basket still sat on the chair by the good lamp, holding the week's accumulated small repairs, the sock that had worn through at the heel, the button that had come off the child's school shirt, the hem that had dropped on the older girl's dress. The radio program that kept the evening company, the voice of Jack Benny or the music of Glenn Miller coming through the speaker of the cabinet radio in the front room, was not just entertainment. It was the sound of the world beyond the house being present in the house, the sense of connection to the larger life that the domestic day sometimes made it easy to forget existed. The radio in 1943 was in a different category of cultural object from what it would become later. It was not background. It was, for most of the day, the primary source of news and the primary source of entertainment, and its programs had genuine fans who followed them with the devotion that later generations would give to television. Jack Benny's Sunday evening program was one of the most listened-to broadcasts in America. Reliably funny, comfortable in its familiar rhythms, offering exactly the kind of gentle escapism that a household managing wartime anxiety needed from its entertainment. The Andrews Sisters on the hit parade, the Glenn Miller Orchestra, whose particular brand of big band swing had become the sound of the era, in a way that is difficult to fully describe to someone who has not lived inside a cultural moment when a specific musical style seems to contain everything about where you are and when. The news, by contrast, was listened to with a different kind of attention. Not the relaxed pleasure of the comedy program or the swaying rhythm of the dance band. The news was listened to closely, with the awareness that somewhere in the report of distant events there might be something that touched your specific household directly. The Pacific Campaign, the European theatre, the names of operations and places that you learned to recognise because your person was in the vicinity of them, or might be, or had been recently. The radio news of the 1940s was different in kind from how we receive information today. It was scheduled, it came at certain times and you gathered around the receiver to listen, and then it was over and you absorbed what it had contained. There was no refreshing, no continuous update, no scroll of incoming information. There was the broadcast, and then there was the silence after it, and in the silence you thought about what you had heard, and what it meant, and what you were going to do with it. That silence after the news was its own texture. Sometimes it held relief. The report had not contained the specific bad thing you had feared. Sometimes it held a specific dread. The report had contained something that needed processing, and you were processing it in the kitchen while the children were in the other room. Sometimes it held simple exhaustion. Another day of the war, ongoing, uncertain, its end not visible from here. And then you picked up the mending. I want to stay with the mending basket for a moment, because it is one of those domestic objects that seems small and is not. Mending, the repair of worn clothing and household textiles rather than their replacement, was not optional in 1943. Clothing was not rationed in the same systematic way as food, but it was limited by the same shortage conditions that limited everything. The War Production Board's regulations governed the amount of fabric that could go into a new garment, eliminating decorative elements and extra pockets and cuffs that used material without serving a function. New shoes were rationed at 1 pair per person per year. The principle was the same across all manufactured goods. What you have, make last. Making clothing last required maintenance. A small hole in a sock, if attended to promptly, remained a small hole. Left unattended, it became a large hole, and a large hole eventually made the sock unwearable, and making it wearable again was a significant repair that used more material and more time than the early intervention would have cost. This logic, repeated across every textile in the household, the children's school clothes, the husband's socks if he was still home, the curtains, the sheets, the kitchen towels, produced a steady accumulation of small tasks that constituted the mending basket. Darning a sock is a particular skill, not a complex one, but a real one. The systematic weaving of a new thread across the whole to create a patch that holds together under use, and does not unravel, that matches the sock's structure well enough to not cause a pressure point inside the shoe, that represents a repair rather than merely a coverage. Women who darned regularly got good at it. The motions became practiced, the tension automatic, the result consistently functional. It was the kind of work you could do while listening to the radio, while being half present in the conversation of the front room, while the children were doing their homework at the table, and the evening was moving quietly toward bedtime. The specific quality of the evening hour in a 1940s house was something between work and rest. Not leisure in the modern sense, the condition of having nothing required of you, the freedom to simply be, but not the full demand of the day either, a middle state in which the hands were occupied and the mind was relatively free, and the freedom of the mind in that state was itself a form of rest. I think this is something we have partly lost, the ability to be in a productive middle state, doing something useful with the hands while the mind wanders or settles, or processes the day's accumulation at its own pace. We have tended toward a sharper distinction between work and rest, either fully engaged or fully disengaged, with the screen as the instrument of disengagement. The 1940s evening was something softer than either. It was the mending basket and the radio, and the comfortable chair, and the hour before bed when the house was quiet enough to be present in without needing to do anything dramatic about it. The children went to bed by 8 or 8:30, later for the older ones. The ritual of it, the washing, the teeth, the pyjamas, the specific negotiation about how long a story, about whether the light could stay on a little longer, about whether the thing that happened today at school could be talked about now or had to wait until morning, was itself a form of comfort for both parent and child. The predictability of the bedtime routine was not incidental. It was its own kind of safety, a structure that held the day's end in a familiar shape regardless of what the day had contained. Then the house was quiet. Not perfectly quiet. Houses of this era were not built for sound insulation the way later houses would be, and the neighbourhood sounds came through. The neighbour's radio, a car passing, the dog 2 houses down making a considered remark about something. But quiet enough that the woman who'd been in motion since before 6 was able to be still, genuinely still, for the first time all day. What happened in that stillness is not something the historical record captures easily. The inner life of the 1940s woman, sitting in her front room with the mending done, and the children asleep, and the radio turned low, and the last quiet hour of the day around her. That is not something she was typically writing down, or not in the sources that tend to survive. But from the letters and the diaries and the memoirs and the advice columns and the fiction of the period you can assemble a partial picture of what it held. Exhaustion, which was the most honest thing. The body that had been working since early morning was tired in the way that productive physical labour makes you tired, not depleted in a disturbing way, but thoroughly used up, ready for the repair of sleep, and something else. The kind of clarity that comes from a day spent in purposeful work, not enlightenment, nothing as dramatic as that. But the particular sense of coherence that comes from having done what needed doing, from having been competent in the face of difficulty, from having held the household together for another day. She was good at this. That is something worth saying plainly. She was good at the thing she'd been doing all day. The food was made, the children were fed, and in their beds and ready for school tomorrow. The household was in its functional shape and would be in its functional shape again in the morning. The ration book had been managed, the victory garden had been tended, the volunteer work had been done, the letter had been written, or would be tomorrow. The ordinary life that she was maintaining in the absence of the person who used to maintain it with her had been maintained. She was tired, and she was good at what she did, and those two things existed in the same person at the same time, and that combination, the tiredness and the competence together, is one of the truest pictures I can give you of what the 1940s housewife actually was. Not a martyr, not a saint, not a symbol of anything beyond herself. A woman who was very good at something very difficult, who did it every day, and who went to bed tired and woke up and did it again. By 1944, something was becoming clear that had not been entirely clear at the war's beginning. The women managing the American home front were not simply enduring the war's conditions. They were, in the very specific and concrete sense, making the war effort possible. I want to spend time in this act looking at the larger picture, not the daily detail of the individual household, but the aggregate of millions of individual households managed with intelligence and discipline and the particular resourcefulness that necessity requires. Because when you step back from the kitchen and the mending basket and look at the scale of what was being managed, the picture becomes genuinely remarkable. 12 million American men in service, 12 million households altered by that departure, many of them managed entirely by women who had not previously been managing them alone. Not just the households of the working and middle classes, the range was complete. Farm households, urban households, households in the south and the north and the Midwest and the coasts, households with money and households without it. The war's demand did not make distinctions, and those households, by and large, functioned. The children were fed and educated, the bills were paid, the victory gardens were planted and the canning was done, and the scrap drives were run, and the bond drives met their targets, and the volunteer organizations that provided the social infrastructure of wartime America kept operating. All of it maintained by women who were doing it largely by themselves. This is a logistical achievement of a scale that we have not adequately credited. Let me give you some numbers that I think help to fix the scale. By 1944, victory gardens in the United States numbered approximately 20 million, producing, as I mentioned earlier, approximately 40% of the country's vegetable supply. The vast majority of those gardens were tended by women. The canning that followed the garden harvest was similarly dominated by women's labour. The USDA estimated that home canning in 1943 doubled the volume of the preceding year, driven by the war emergency and the active promotion of home preservation as a patriotic activity. The war bond campaigns raised approximately $185 billion over the war's duration. A significant portion of that money came from door-to-door bond sales, which were organised and conducted primarily by women's volunteer organisations. The neighbourhood-level social networks that made door-to-door sales possible were the same networks that ran the scrap drives and the blood drives and the Red Cross chapters. Women's networks, organised and maintained by women as part of the daily work of neighbourhood life. The civilian nursing training programme, which trained hundreds of thousands of auxiliary nurses to supplement the professional medical personnel going to war, was dominated by women volunteers who gave tens of thousands of collective hours to training that would be used if the war came to American cities in ways it never did, but who trained anyway, seriously and competently, because the threat was real enough to prepare for. The nutrition programs organised through the extension services and the women's clubs helped to maintain the health of the civilian population under rationing conditions that might, without guidance and organisation, have produced nutritional deficiencies on a significant scale. The fact that this largely did not happen, that the wartime civilian diet, limited as it was, remained nutritionally adequate for most of the population, was not accidental. It was the result of sustained, organised education and the women who carried that education into millions of households through their community networks. I am describing this in aggregate because I want to convey the scale, but the scale was composed of individual decisions and individual acts of competence, made by individual women in individual households and neighbourhoods. The 20 million victory gardens were 20 million separate planting decisions made by 20 million separate people who decided that the effort was worth making and who had the knowledge to make the effort successful. The aggregate was built from the particular. Now let me talk about something that the victory narrative tends to skip over: the difficulty. By 1944, the war had been going for almost 3 years. 3 years of rationing, 3 years of shortages, 3 years of managing households without the people who used to manage them with you, 3 years of waiting for letters and reading the war news and managing the anxiety in front of the children, 3 years of exhaustion managed through competence rather than resolved through rest. The strain showed in some places. The divorce rate, which was already rising before the war, accelerated during it. A combination of hasty wartime marriages made under emotional pressure, and the genuine estrangement that years of separation could produce. The children's welfare organisations of the period documented rising incidences of what they called latchkey children, children coming home to empty houses because their mothers were working in factories, and the extended family and neighbourhood networks that had previously provided supervision were stretched thin. Not every household managed well. Not every woman who was left to manage had the resources, economic, social, psychological, to do so competently. The stories of the ones who managed are easier to find, because competent management does not produce records the way crisis does. But the crisis was there too, in the families that fell apart under the pressure, in the women who broke in ways they could not entirely put back together, in the children who carried into adulthood the specific damage of a wartime childhood, in a household that was not holding. I want to name this honestly, not because I want to diminish what the majority of women accomplished, but because the honest picture is the important one. The 1940s housewife was not a superhuman figure. She was a human figure in extraordinary circumstances, doing the best she could with what she had, and the best she could was often genuinely extraordinary, and was also sometimes insufficient, and both of these things are true and worth honouring. The women who managed well during the war years were not managing well because they were constitutionally different from the women who struggled. They were managing because they had resources, social networks, economic buffers, practical knowledge, psychological resilience, that the conditions of their lives had provided them, and which the conditions of other lives had withheld. The woman with a good neighbourhood network, supportive family members nearby, sufficient income, and the practical knowledge of how to stretch a household budget managed better than the woman who was geographically isolated, economically precarious, without family support, and without the accumulated domestic knowledge that was transmitted through community and practice. This is not a moral distinction. It is a structural one. What the best managed households of the period demonstrated was not that individual virtue is sufficient. It was that knowledge and community and practical competence together are remarkable. That the combination of knowing how to do the thing and having people to do it with produces results that neither component alone could achieve. This is the larger lesson of the 1940s Homefront, and it is a lesson worth sitting with. The knowledge was not accidental. It was transmitted through mothers and grandmothers and neighbours and extension agents and the women's magazines and the community organisations that had been building the infrastructure of women's knowledge sharing for generations before the war. The knowledge of how to can tomatoes and how to manage a ration book and how to darn a sock and how to make a meatloaf from the available ingredients and how to talk to a frightened child about an absent father. This knowledge had origins, and it had been passed carefully from hand to hand, mostly by women, in the unspectacular educational exchange of domestic life. The community was not accidental either. The neighbourhood networks that proved so effective in wartime were not built in 1942. They were built over years of ordinary proximity, the conversations over backyard fences, the borrowing and returning, the mutual aid of small daily favours extended and received, until the relationship between neighbours had become something load-bearing, something you could put real weight on when the weight needed somewhere to rest. When the war came, these existing structures of knowledge and community were available to be activated. The government did not build them. The wartime emergency did not create them. It only revealed their value in a context that made that value suddenly, urgently clear. And then the war ended. In August 1945, the Japanese surrender brought an end to the war, and the homecoming began. 12 million men returning to the households and communities they had left, many of them having been gone for 3 or 4 years, returning, to lives that had continued without them, and to women who had been managing those lives alone. The homecoming was not simply a return to normal, it was a renegotiation, and the renegotiation was not always easy. The woman who had managed the household alone for 4 years had developed, out of necessity, capabilities and an independence that had not been as fully exercised before the war. She had managed money, managed the maintenance of the house, made all the decisions about the children and the household and the community without needing to consult anyone. She had, in the process, developed a confidence in her own judgment and competence that was real and grounded in demonstrated ability. The returning man came home to a household that had been running without him, managed by a woman who knew very well how to manage it. The adjustment required on both sides was genuine, and the pressure to return to pre-war domestic arrangements, the husband's authority, the wife's deference, was social and cultural and intense. The magazine articles of 1945 and 1946 are full of advice about how women could ease the returning veteran's transition, how to make the home feel like his again, how to step back from the responsibilities they had assumed and make space for the man to reassume them. Some women stepped back easily, or appeared to. Some stepped back with difficulty and resentment they were not given permission to express. Some never quite stepped back at all, maintaining in practice the competence and independence they had built during the war while performing, in social terms, the domestic deference that the cultural script required. The post-war pressure to forget what the war had demonstrated, that women were capable of managing households, communities, and significant portions of the war's material and social infrastructure by themselves, is one of the stranger chapters of American cultural history. The women who had done all of this were being asked, quite explicitly, to pretend they had not, or at least not to make it an argument for any larger claim about what women were capable of. Many of them complied, at least on the surface. The 1950s suburban domesticity that the popular culture of that decade is associated with was, in significant part, the organised cultural amnesia of a society that had seen what its women could do, and was not sure what to do with the evidence. But the knowledge did not go away. It was in their hands. In the specific and practiced competence of women who knew how to make food from very little, who knew how to manage a household under conditions of real scarcity, who had organised communities and run volunteer organisations and tended gardens and maintained children and written letters to absent soldiers and managed their fear and theirs of their children simultaneously. That knowledge was in them, whether the culture acknowledged it or not. I want to sit with something for a moment before we move toward the close. There is a phrase that I keep encountering in the accounts and memoirs and letters that survive from women of this generation. It comes in various forms, in different words, but the substance is consistent. It sounds something like this: we just did what needed doing. Sometimes, I never thought of it as anything special. Sometimes, everyone was doing the same. The phrase functions as a deflection of the attention being paid to the account of what they did, a refusal of the status of remarkable, a recategorization of the extraordinary into the ordinary. I understand this refusal. It comes from something genuine. The woman who managed a household through 4 years of wartime rationing did not, in most cases, experience herself as heroic. She experienced herself as managing, as getting through the week, as making sure the children were fed and the house was running and the bills were paid. She did not have the leisure to assess her own performance in the way that someone looking back from a distance can. She was inside it, and inside it, it was just Tuesday. This is actually the same as true. It was Tuesday, and it was also extraordinary. The specific knowledge required to manage a household through the conditions of the Second World War. The ration book intelligence, the canning science, the gardening knowledge, the child management, the emotional discipline, the community organisation, the financial management without the financial cushion that abundance provides. This was not common knowledge that any person could have assembled from scratch. It was accumulated knowledge, transmitted across generations, practiced and refined over years, and it was hard-won in the specific sense that the winning of it required effort and failure and adjustment and more effort. We have in subsequent decades organised ourselves in ways that have made significant portions of this knowledge unnecessary, or at least not routinely practiced. The supermarket's abundance has made the ration book knowledge irrelevant. The frozen meal has made the scratch cooking knowledge optional. The professional childcare industry has partially redistributed the caregiving knowledge that was previously concentrated in families and neighbourhoods. These are not pure losses. Many of them represent genuine improvements in the quality of life, particularly for women who are no longer required by economic necessity to develop and exercise these skills as the primary condition of their adult existence. But something has also changed in the process, and I think it is worth naming clearly. When knowledge is no longer practiced, it degrades, not immediately and not completely. You can recover skills that have lapsed, you can relearn what you have forgotten, you can access through books and instruction, and community what you cannot access through personal experience. But there is a different kind of knowing that comes from practice, from the daily exercise of a skill in real conditions with real consequences that is not fully replicable from books. The woman who canned tomatoes every summer for 20 years knew tomato canning in her hands, in her timing, in the specific sensory signals that told her the jar had sealed properly, or the heat was too high, or the tomatoes were ready to come out of the water bath. That knowing was not in her head alone, it was in her whole body, accumulated over years, reliable in conditions where more purely intellectual knowledge can fail. We have transferred a great deal of the knowledge that was once held in the bodies and hands of ordinary people into systems and institutions that provide the outcomes of that knowledge, without requiring individuals to hold the knowledge themselves. You do not need to know how to grow tomatoes if the grocery store has tomatoes. You do not need to know how to repair clothing if new clothing is cheap enough to replace the worn. You do not need to know how to make soup from a ham bone if the can of soup on the shelf is accessible and affordable and takes 3 minutes to prepare. These are real advantages, and I do not want to pretend they are not. But I also want to say this. There is a condition of dependence that comes with the outsourcing of practical knowledge, and that condition of dependence is not without cost. The cost is not always apparent in ordinary times, when the systems and institutions that hold the knowledge on our behalf are functioning normally. The cost becomes apparent in extraordinary times, in emergencies, in disruptions, in the conditions that the women of the 1940s managed daily, when the systems that normally provide the outcomes without requiring personal knowledge are interrupted. In 2020, when a pandemic disrupted supply chains and grocery stores and the entire ordinary infrastructure of food access. There was a notable and widespread return to the domestic practices of the 1940s home front. Home baking proliferated. Home gardening saw a significant resurgence. People who had never learned to cook from scratch began learning. The practical knowledge that the 1940s housewife held in her hands and had refined over a lifetime was suddenly wanted again, and the people reaching for it found, in many cases, that they did not have it easily accessible. They had to look it up. They had to find someone who knew. They had to ask their grandmothers, if their grandmothers were still available to ask. I do not say this to make an argument for austerity, or to suggest that we should return to rationing as a way of developing useful skills. That would be an absurd prescription. I say it because the phenomenon of 2020 made visible something that is ordinarily invisible. The practical knowledge of the 1940s homefront was genuinely useful knowledge, and its degradation through disuse has left us with a specific kind of fragility that we do not always notice. There is something else I want to say about the recognition, or rather, the lack of it. The women who managed the American homefront during the Second World War received, in the moment, a certain acknowledgement of their contribution. The government's wartime propaganda told them, explicitly and repeatedly, that what they were doing mattered. The Victory Garden poster, the bond drive campaigns, the magazine features on wartime cooking, the specific and repeated message that the domestic act was a war act, that feeding your family well on rations was a contribution to the war effort. This acknowledgement was real and mattered to them. It was also, I want to note, conditional. It was acknowledgement that depended on the framing of their domestic work as war work, as an emergency exception to the normal invisibility of household labour. The message was, what you are doing now, in this emergency, is important. The implicit flip side of that message was, in normal times, what you do in the kitchen and the garden and the neighbourhood is less important. It is simply what women do. It does not require acknowledgement. The end of the war removed the wartime framing that had given domestic labour its visible importance, and with the removal of that framing came, for many women, the return of the ordinary invisibility. The house ran. The children were fed. The neighbourhood functioned. The knowledge and competence and daily effort that maintained all of this continued to be expended and continued to be largely unacknowledged, because the emergency that had made it legible as a contribution was over. I'm not trying to make this into a political argument, though the political implications are obvious. I am trying to describe what actually happened to a generation of women who had done something remarkable, and were then asked to stop presenting it as remarkable. What they carried forward, quietly, practically in the texture of their daily lives and in the knowledge they passed to their children and grandchildren, was the thing itself, not the recognition, the skill, the competence, the practiced intelligence of making a household work under difficult conditions, the knowledge of how to stretch $1 in a ration book and a garden bed and a jar of preserved tomatoes into something that keeps people fed and keeps a family together and keeps the walls of a life standing when the conditions of that life are actively working against it. That is what I want to take from this story. Not the patriotism, not the sacrifice, not the symbol, the actual thing. The skill in the hands and the knowledge in the body and the quiet daily act of making the world function. I think about the 1940s housewife sometimes, when I am standing in a supermarket aisle, looking at 40 varieties of bread and trying to decide which one to buy. Not with nostalgia for simpler times. They were not simpler, they were harder. Not with guilt about my abundance. Abundance is something to be grateful for, but with a specific kind of respect. For the woman who could not stand in that aisle because the aisle did not exist, and who made the bread anyway, from flour and water and the knowledge of how, and fed her family well from it. Her knowledge was not magic, and it was not heroism. It was the accumulated competence of someone who had been paying close attention to the real conditions of the life she was living, for long enough to understand them thoroughly and act within them skillfully. It was the craft knowledge of the domestic world, earned the slow way, through practice and failure and adjustment and daily sustained effort. We have, in many respects, moved beyond the necessity that required it. This is genuinely good. But there are moments when I think we have let the knowledge go a little too easily, and that in letting it go we have lost not just a skill, but a relationship with the material conditions of our own lives that was, in its demanding and unglamorous way, quite valuable. There is something about constraint that sharpens attention. When you have to think carefully about every cup of flour and every ration stamp, you develop a relationship with the material of daily life that abundance does not require. You know what is in your pantry. You know what your family will and will not eat. You know how to make the meal from what is there rather than from what you would prefer to have. In other words, how to work with reality as it is rather than as you would like it to be. This is not a trivial skill. It is, in a sense, the foundation of all practical intelligence. The 1940s housewife had it in abundance, in the specific and enacted sense. She had it because she practiced it every day of a decade that left her no choice about whether to practice it. She was good at working with reality as it was. She had to be. That goodness, that practiced competence with the real, is what I want to carry from this story. Not the wartime framing, not the mythology, not the image, the actual thing that happened, in actual kitchens, on actual mornings, in a country managing the hardest sustained challenge of the 20th century one day, and one meal and one mended sock at a time. The kitchen is light now, the same woman, the same morning, the same kitchen. The coffee is still on, a second pot or the end of the first, the smell of it settled into every corner of the room, in the way it does when it has been there for hours. The children are at school, the house is quiet, the morning light comes in at a different angle than it did at 5:30, fuller, more specific. It falls on the dish towel folded over the oven handle and stays there a moment, warming the worn cotton, making visible the small precise imperfection of the hand-embroidered edging that someone put there years ago. It falls on the row of canning jars on the windowsill. The 3 she brought up from the basement this morning to check the seals, the glass catching the yellow light and holding it, amber and ordinary and full. It falls on the letter on the counter, still unopened. She will open it today. She will open it when she's ready, which is different from when she wants to, which is different from when she's afraid. She knows the difference. The light is on the dish towel. The house is still. She's still here. Let me say something about the front porch, because it is one of the features of the 1940s house that has nearly disappeared from the American residential landscape, and whose disappearance has consequences that go beyond aesthetics. The front porch of a 1940s house was not decorative. It was functional in a specific social way that the American house would not recover once the air conditioner and the television had rearranged the household's relationship to the outdoors. On a summer evening, the front porch was where the family went after dinner. It was where you sat in the particular relief of the slightly cooler air and watched the street and spoke to the neighbours who were on their own porches or walking past. It was, in other words, a transitional space between the private interior of the house and the public space of the neighbourhood. You were visible from the porch. You could be spoken to. The conversation that began there between 2 women on adjacent porches shouted across 20 feet of yard in the easy familiarity of people who know each other's daily lives was the organic civic life of the neighbourhood. The house without a front porch, or with a front porch that is never used, has no such transitional space. The private interior and the public exterior are adjacent with no mediating zone. You go inside or you go out. You do not linger in the in-between, and the in-between, it turns out, was doing considerable social work. Inside the house, the rooms had a different relationship to each other than we might expect from a contemporary floor plan. The bathroom, in many 1940s houses, was a single shared room. One bathroom for an entire family, sometimes a family of 4 or 5 or 6. This sharing of space that we now consider intensely private had consequences for family dynamics that are difficult to fully assess, but that are worth noting. Privacy, in the 1940s house, was a negotiated condition rather than an architectural given. You found it when you could. You understood that others in the household had the same need, and that meeting that need required coordination and patience, and the low-grade daily diplomacy of shared space. The bedroom, specifically the master bedroom, the parents' room, was often the most private space in the house, but its privacy was relative. In a house with thin walls and a single floor, sound travelled. The conversations that took place in the bedroom were not as private as they might seem from the outside. The family's emotional weather was audible in the house, in a way that contemporary families, in houses with better insulation and more architectural complexity, might not fully register. The children heard more than they were meant to hear, and the adults knew they heard more than they were meant to hear. and this mutual awareness was itself a feature of the domestic landscape, shaping what was said and what was left unsaid, and in what tones and at what hours. The basement in northern and midwestern houses deserves more attention than I gave it earlier. It was not simply a storage and utility space. It was a working space in the fullest sense, a second kitchen in some respects where the messiest work of the household was done. The wringer washer, as I mentioned, stood there, but so did the canning operation in late summer and early fall. So did the coal or oil furnace, which in a cold climate required regular management during the months between October and April. The woman who managed the furnace, banking the coals properly at night, adjusting the damper in the morning to build the fire back up, maintaining the temperature of the house through the particular demands of a midwinter cold snap, was managing an industrial process at a domestic scale, and she was managing it alone if her husband was not there to share it. The attic, too, was a working space in the 1940s house, not merely a storage place for things that had been given up on. Seasonal clothing was stored there, carefully wrapped against moths and dust. The things that were no longer in regular use but might be needed someday lived there in organised condition. The organised condition was itself evidence of something. The household that maintained its attic in order was a household that was managing its resources carefully, that understood the difference between what was needed now and what might be needed later, that did not discard carelessly, because replacement was not guaranteed. All of this, the front porch, and the single bathroom and the shared walls and the working basement and the organised attic, adds up to something that is harder to name but easier to feel when you're inside it. The 1940s house was a house that asked for active relationship with it. It did not manage itself. It did not disappear into the background of the life being lived inside it. It was present and demanding and full of texture, and the person who managed it had a specific and practiced knowledge of every part of it that is different from the generic comfort of a house that has been designed to require as little from you as possible. There is a particular smell I have not mentioned and should. The smell of the 1940s house in winter, when the furnace was running and the windows were closed, was a specific and complex thing. Wood smoke, or coal smoke, if that was what the furnace burned. The smell of food that had been cooked recently and had settled into the walls and the curtains in the way that cooking smells do in houses that are cooked in seriously and regularly. The particular smell of wool, the coats hanging in the hall, the sweaters in the bedroom dresser, the yarn in the mending basket. The smell of ivory soap and whatever cleaning solution was used on the floors. The smell of whatever was simmering on the range, which in a well-managed winter household was very often the smell of soup stock. The slow, rich accumulation of bones and vegetables and thyme. This is not a neutral smell. It is the smell of a house that is occupied and warm and in use. It is the smell of domestic life in its most basic and functional form, and it is quite different from the smell of a house that is heated by invisible forced air and cleaned with products designed to smell like nothing. I find that smell, when I encounter something close to it now, deeply orienting. Not nostalgic exactly, something more physiological than that, as if the smell carries in itself the information of the world it belongs to, and that information is legible in the body even when the mind is not sure what to do with it. The 1940s house was a world made of specific materials in specific arrangements, and the arrangement of those materials was not arbitrary. It reflected the specific requirements of a life that was managing itself with limited resources and considerable competence. The kitchen at the centre, because the kitchen was where the work was done and the warmth was generated. The front porch at the boundary, because the boundary between private and public was not hard but graduated. The basement beneath, where the mess and the production happened out of sight but not out of mind. This geography was a form of intelligence, not designed by an architect or not only by architects, evolved, over decades, in response to the actual requirements of the lives being lived inside it. I want to say more about what the planning minutes actually contained, because I think the intellectual dimension of them is underrepresented in how we talk about this period. The woman making her early morning plans was running several calculations simultaneously. The first was the immediate calculation. What does today's day hold? What are its specific requirements? What resources does it draw from? And is there anything that needs to be prepared or arranged or anticipated in the next 2 hours before the household is fully in motion? This calculation was primarily logistical, and she was very good at it because she had been doing it every morning for years. But the second calculation was temporal. Not just today, but the week. The ration book's current state told her how many stamps remained and how many days remained in the allocation period, and the intersection of those two numbers told her how the week's meals needed to be planned. If the red stamps were running low on the 17th and the new allocation did not come until the 1st of the following month, then the meals of the remaining 10 days needed to be built around what was not rationed. The eggs that were available but limited, the beans that required no stamps, the vegetables from the canning shelf, and the winter-stored root vegetables from the basement. This was not a crisis. It was a logistics problem with known parameters and multiple solutions, and she carried the parameters in her head as a matter of ordinary daily life. The third calculation was social. Who in the neighbourhood had what? Who owed whom a return of what? Who was running short in ways that might benefit from a discreet intervention? Who had surplus that might be available for exchange? The neighbourhood's informal exchange economy was not chaotic. It had its own accountancy, maintained in memory by the women who ran it, and the morning was partly when that accountancy was updated and its implications considered. None of this was written down. That is the thing I want you to register. The planning that happened in those early morning minutes happened in the woman's head, in the particular kind of organised mental space that people who manage complex logistics, who are responsible for multiple intersecting systems and the relationships between them, develop over time. The farm family calls this husbandry, though the word is gendered in a direction that is not helpful here. It is the intelligence of managing a living system, knowing all its parts and how they interact, maintaining the awareness of the whole while attending to the detail, anticipating the future from the evidence of the present. She was doing this every morning before 6 o'clock, in a kitchen with the coffee on. This is worth more recognition than it has received. The specific content of the morning's first hour varied with the season, and the seasonal variation is itself worth tracing, because it tells you something about the rhythm of domestic life in this period. In winter, the morning's first task, before even the coffee, was often the furnace. The coal or oil furnace that had been banked for the night needed to be encouraged back to full capacity before the family woke into a house that was significantly colder than it would be by evening. Tending the furnace in a house where no one else was yet awake was a quiet, specific physical task. Checking the fire's state, adjusting the damper, adding fuel if needed, reading the particular signs that the furnace communicated through its sounds and smells about what it needed. Women who managed furnaces learned to read these signs with the same practiced attention they brought to everything else the house required. In spring, the morning's calculation included the garden. Not yet the working garden of summer. In April or early May, still too cold for most planting, but the planning garden, the question of what the year's garden would hold, and in what proportion and in what sequence. Seed catalogues had been arriving since January, and the woman who took her garden seriously spent time in them, the way another person might spend time in a travel brochure. Not just for information, but for the specific pleasure of imagining what might be possible. What the canning shelf would hold next October if the season was good. What new variety of tomato would perform better in the particular conditions of this particular backyard. In summer, the morning calculation was dominated by the garden's harvest. What was ready today, what would be ready by tomorrow, whether the beans were coming in faster than the canning supplies could process them, whether it was worth picking the early tomatoes or waiting for the full ripeness that would make the canned product better. The summer morning was the most physically demanding of the year's mornings, because the garden required active work in the cool of the early hours, before the heat made sustained outdoor labour difficult, and the canning that followed a productive garden day was its own full day's work. In full, the morning calculation was the accounting of what the summer had produced and whether it was enough. How many jars of tomatoes on the shelf? How many of beans? How many of corn? How many quarts of peaches? How many pints of strawberry jam? How many jars of pickles? Laid out against the winter's anticipated requirements, 6 months of suppers, 6 months of school lunches, the particular demands of the holidays which required foods that were not rationed but were expensive. The canning shelf either looked adequate or it didn't, and if it didn't, there was still time in October and even into November to address the shortfalls through the root vegetables that could be stored in the basement, the dried beans and lentils that kept well, the late-season apples that could be made into butter and sauce and stored. This seasonal rhythm of the household's logistics was not separate from the daily rhythm. It was the same intelligence operating on a longer time scale. The woman who managed the household well managed it on all 3 timescales simultaneously: the immediate, the weekly, and the seasonal. She was always in all 3 of them at once, the way a good gardener is always thinking about this year's harvest, and next year's soil amendment, and the 5-year rotation that will keep the beds productive. There is another dimension to the early morning that I have not yet addressed, and it is the emotional one. The planning minutes were the woman's own time, as the newspaper columnist I mentioned observed. But they were also, in the specific context of the wartime household, often the only time she had to feel clearly what she actually felt. The day that followed the early morning was a day of managed emotion, not suppressed exactly, but calibrated. In front of the children you were steady. In front of the neighbours you were managing. On the telephone with your mother-in-law you were positive. At the Red Cross chapter meeting, you were competent and organised. There were very few spaces in the day where you could simply be what you were, feel what you felt, let the management of your own interior relax. The early morning was one of those spaces. Alone in the kitchen with the coffee, before anyone needed anything from you, you could think about the letter that had not come this week and feel what the absence of the letter meant. You could run through, one more time, the last letter you received and the things in it that you were still passing, the gap between what he was saying and what the censorship might have removed, the particular word he used that you were still turning over. You could be tired in the way you actually were tired, which was a deeper kind of tired than the ordinary physical exhaustion of a long day's work. You could be frightened, briefly and quietly, and then put the fear back where it lived for the rest of the day. This emotional management, the daily discipline of feeling your actual feelings in the 1 hour when there was no one to manage them for, and then returning to the managed state that the day required, was its own form of psychological labour. It is not glamorous. It does not appear on any service record or in any official accounting of the Homefront's contribution. But it was the work that made all the other work possible, and it was real. I want to go deeper into the specific texture of rationing as it was experienced, because the abstraction of the point system does not fully convey what it was like to live inside it day to day. The point value of items changed weekly, and the change was announced through the newspapers and through signs at grocery stores. This meant that the woman, doing her weekly shopping, could not plan with perfect accuracy more than a few days ahead. She had to stay current. She had to read the weekly column in the newspaper that explained the changes in point values. She had to notice the posted signs at the grocer's. She had to absorb these changes and adjust her plans accordingly every week, without accumulating the surplus that would allow a buffer against the variability. The grocer was a figure of considerable importance in this system. The local grocery store was not the supermarket of later decades. It was a smaller, more personal operation, often family-owned and operated, where the relationship between shopper and storekeeper was ongoing and specific. The grocer knew his regular customers. He knew what they usually bought. He knew when something they regularly purchased was not available this week and it was worth telling them. He also, being a human person in the middle of a complex and sometimes chaotic rationing system, made occasional exceptions and adjustments that the official system did not formally permit. Not corruption exactly. The informal accommodations of a system being administered by people who had relationships with each other and who understood that the official rules could not cover every actual situation. The grocer who put aside a pound of hamburger for the woman who had been a regular customer for 8 years and who had not been able to get any in 3 weeks was not undermining the rationing system's fundamental purpose. He was operating in the grey area that all complex systems generate when they meet real human conditions. These informal accommodations were not universally available. They depended on the relationships you had, which depended on how long you had been in the neighbourhood, and how well you were known and whether you were the kind of person whose reliability and goodwill the grocer had had reason to observe. Women who were new to a neighbourhood, or who were managing on very limited budgets and had less regular custom to offer, did not have the same access to informal accommodation as the established regular customer. This is one of the ways that the wartime rationing system was not uniformly experienced. The official allocation was the same for everyone, household by household, per person per week. But the unofficial accommodations that supplemented the official system were unevenly distributed, and the distribution tracked the existing social networks of trust and relationship that the neighbourhood contained, which is to say, it tracked existing social inequality in a modest but real way. The woman shopping for her household also had to navigate the physical reality of wartime grocery shopping, which was considerably more demanding than contemporary grocery shopping, in ways that are worth understanding. The store was not always stocked. The items on the official rationing list were subject to genuine shortage, not just point value management. Some weeks the rationed item simply was not available at the quantities the rationing system notionally provided for. You arrived at the store with your red stamps and the cut of meat you needed was not there, and you had to decide on the spot what to do instead. This required the kind of flexible menu planning that the most capable housewives had refined into a genuine skill. The ability to walk into a grocery store with a mental list and a budget and a stamp allocation, and walk out with the components of a week's meals, regardless of whether the specific items on the mental list were actually available. This improvisation was not a minor skill. It required a detailed knowledge of what could substitute for what. Dried beans could substitute for canned ones, but required longer cooking and planning ahead. Chicken could substitute for beef in most contexts, but required different preparation times and techniques. Egg noodles could substitute for rice in a casserole, but the proportions needed adjustment. The woman who walked into a grocery store without her specific list items and walked out with a functional week's worth of meals had done a non-trivial piece of on-the-spot logistics, drawing on years of accumulated knowledge about ingredients and techniques, and her family's particular preferences. The family's particular preferences mattered in a specific wartime way. There were foods that the children would accept cheerfully, foods that required careful presentation to be acceptable, foods that were simply not going to happen regardless of how the rationing demanded their use. Managing the intersection of available foods with family palatability was its own dimension of the week's planning, and it was not trivial. A week of meals that no one actually ate was worse than a week of meals with less nutritional variety that everyone consumed fully, because food left on plates was waste, and waste in 1943 was something close to a moral category. The food waste question, the injunction against it, the cultural expectation that food was too scarce and too hard-won to throw away, shaped the kitchen practices of the 1940s household in specific ways that are visible in the recipes and cooking advice of the period. The scrap jar in the refrigerator, the practice of saving every piece of edible food that was left from a meal, no matter how small, the half cup of peas, the tablespoon of drippings, the crust of bread that did not get eaten at dinner, in a jar or container designated for this purpose, to be incorporated into the next day's soup or hash or other catch-all dish. This practice, described in dozens of wartime cookbooks and magazine features, was not presented as evidence of poverty or desperation. It was presented as good management, as the right relationship between a household and its food supply, as the practical intelligence of someone who understood that the resources available were not to be squandered. The bread that was going stale became breadcrumbs for the meatloaf, or croutons for the soup, or bread pudding for dessert. The chicken carcass after the Sunday chicken became the stock that carried the week's soups. The fat trimmed from a piece of meat was rendered and saved for cooking. The coffee grounds were used twice, the second pot weaker than the first but acceptable. The egg whites left from a recipe that used only yolks went into meringue, or were whipped into a frosting that stretched the limited sugar ration further by incorporating air. These practices were not unique to the 1940s. They're as old as food scarcity itself, which is to say as old as human cooking. But the wartime household practiced them with a consistency and a systematization that was relatively new to a generation of American women who had grown up in a period of general abundance and were now encountering genuine constraint for the first time. The adjustment was not seamless for everyone. Some women found the constraints genuinely distressing, not just inconvenient but destabilizing, a reminder of a reduced life that felt like a diminishment. Others found them clarifying, a focusing of attention and effort that produced a quality of engagement with the household's resources that abundance had not required. The women who wrote most positively about the wartime kitchen experience in letters and columns and memoirs were often the women for whom the constraints had been the occasion of something that felt like mastery, the development of skills and confidence that the easy pre-war kitchen had not demanded. There is a psychology here worth understanding, the experience of being genuinely good at something difficult, of having the problem and knowing how to address it, of feeling the competence in your hands and your timing and your results. This experience is not easily available in conditions of abundance, where the easy solution is usually the correct one. It is more available in conditions of constraint, where the easy solution is not available and the correct one requires genuine knowledge and skill. The women who developed that knowledge and skill in the 1940s kitchen were experiencing something that their peacetime predecessors and successors would largely not have access to, and the record suggests that many of them recognised and valued it. I want to go more deeply into the actual work of the garden, because the phrase victory garden has become such a cultural shorthand that its physical reality sometimes gets lost. The soil work. Let me start there, because without good soil, none of the rest of it was possible, and getting to good soil from the baseline of a suburban backyard required real labour. Most urban and suburban backyards in 1941, when the Victory Garden campaign was beginning to ramp up, had never been cultivated. The soil in them was whatever the house's construction had left, often compacted subsoil brought to the surface by excavation, or the tired thin topsoil of a lawn that had been growing nothing but grass for a decade or two, or the hard-packed clay that characterises large areas of the Midwest and parts of the East. None of these starting conditions were ideal for vegetable gardening. All of them required amendment. The spade turned the soil. This is not a metaphor. You took a spade and you pushed it into the ground with your foot, and you turned the soil over, and you did this for every square foot of the garden bed, and then you did it again in the other direction, and if the soil was heavy you did it a third time. This work, spread over several days in early spring, was physically demanding in a way that left muscles aching and hands blistered in people who were not accustomed to it. Many women who took up victory gardening in 1942 were not accustomed to it. They did it anyway, because the garden was necessary, and because the first spring's soreness would give way to the second spring's capability if they kept at it. The organic matter that needed to be worked into the soil to improve its structure and fertility came from several sources. The compost pile, if there was one, contributed the best amendment. Many women who had not previously kept compost started keeping it in 1942, because the government's guidance made clear that kitchen scraps and garden debris were resources to be captured rather than discarded. The vegetable peelings and the spent plants and the fallen leaves and the coffee grounds and the eggshells all went into the pile and were transformed, over months, into the dark, crumbly, richly scented material that experienced gardeners called black gold. But compost takes time to mature, and the first year's garden did not have the benefit of compost unless the gardener could source it elsewhere. Well-rotted animal manure available in rural and semi-rural areas from nearby farms was an excellent amendment and was used wherever it could be obtained. Peat moss, though somewhat acid in its effect, improved soil structure. Dried leaves, dug in and left to decompose over winter, improved both structure and fertility. Some gardeners, in areas where they were available, used fish meal or bone meal as fertilizer, bought at the hardware store or farm supply in small quantities. The work of improving the soil was not a one-season project. It was a multi-year investment in a resource that paid returns in proportion to the investment made. The gardener who had amended her soil conscientiously for 3 years had a fundamentally different starting point than the first-year gardener, and the difference was visible in the productivity of her plants and the quality of her harvest. This gradual improvement, this accumulation of horticultural capital, was one of the satisfactions of a garden maintained over time. You could see the soil getting better, feel it changing under your hands from the heavy, reluctant clay of the first year toward the responsive, workable medium of a well-established garden. The seed catalogues that arrived in January were not merely shopping catalogues. They were planning tools, and the woman who used them well used them as such, reading the variety descriptions carefully, comparing the days to maturity figures against her local frost-free period, considering the disease resistance ratings that determined how likely a variety was to survive the particular challenges of her climate and conditions. The Victory Garden programme's official recommendations included a relatively limited list of tried-and-true varieties, but the seed catalogues offered more, and women with prior gardening experience often went beyond the official list to varieties they knew from experience or had reason to believe would perform well. Succession planting, the practice of making multiple small plantings of the same crop at 2-week intervals rather than one large planting, was recommended in all of the period's gardening guidance and practiced by experienced gardeners, though it required a discipline of timing and record-keeping that not all gardeners maintained. The principle was straightforward. If you plant all your beans on the same day, they all come ready at the same time, and you cannot eat or can that much at once without waste. If you plant a third of your beans now, a third in 2 weeks, and a third in 4 weeks, the harvest is spread over 6 weeks, each successive planting coming ready just as the previous one is finishing, and the total, Amount canned is greater because none of it is lost to over-ripening. The record-keeping that supported good gardening was modest but real. A notebook or the back of the seed catalogue where you noted what you planted when, what germinated well and what did not, which variety performed best in your particular conditions, which pests arrived and when, and what treatment was effective. This record, accumulated over years, was a form of garden knowledge specific to your particular plot. Knowledge that no general-purpose gardening guide could provide because your garden's microclimate and soil and pest pressure were particular to your location. Women who kept garden notebooks and amended their practices from year to year based on what the record showed were doing something that agricultural extension services called applied research, though they would not have used that term. They were developing, from scratch, the specific and localized knowledge of how to grow food in their particular place. This knowledge was hard-won and genuinely valuable, and it made their gardens better every year they kept it. The pests deserved their own chapter and their own lexicon of response. Japanese beetle grubs in the soil attacking bean and corn roots, hornworm caterpillars on the tomatoes, enormous green caterpillars that could strip a plant of its foliage overnight, if not detected and removed. Squash vine borer, the invisible destructor of an otherwise thriving squash plant, its evidence the sudden wilting of a vine that had looked fine yesterday. Aphids on the beans and the kale, soft-bodied and numerous and resistant to casual management. Cutworms at the soil surface, cutting newly planted seedlings off at the base with a neatness that was infuriating. The management of these pests in the era before synthetic pesticides were widely available for home garden use was primarily mechanical and cultural. You picked the hornworms by hand and dropped them in a can of soapy water. You cultivated around the base of plants to expose and kill cutworm pupae. You planted marigolds at the garden's edge on the theory, widespread at the time, that their scent repelled certain insects, a theory whose scientific support is modest but whose practice was nearly universal. You rotated crops from bed to bed from year to year to break the pest cycles that built in soil when the same family of plants was grown in the same place repeatedly. All of this management required knowledge, attention, and time. The garden was not a passive growing operation. It was an active one, requiring the gardener to be present in it regularly, ideally daily, observing its state, noticing the first signs of problems before they became serious, maintaining the culture of close attention that the garden rewarded with productivity and punished with failure when it lapsed. The woman tending her victory garden in July, in the early morning before the heat settled, was doing this observational work. Moving through the rows, looking at the condition of each plant, checking the soil moisture, noticing the first signs of the hornworm or the early yellowing that suggested a nutrient deficiency, or the slight wilting in a vine that might be the beginning of the borer's attack. She was reading the garden the way an experienced practitioner reads any complex system, through accumulated pattern recognition, through the particular sensitivity of someone who has been paying attention for long enough to know what normal looks like, and to notice when something departs from normal. The harvest, when it came, arrived on its own schedule and in its own quantities, and the canning that followed had to accommodate both. A productive garden in a good year produced abundance that was genuinely difficult to process in time. The beans came in quantity, and beans needed to be canned within 24 to 48 hours of picking because they deteriorated rapidly. The tomatoes ripened in waves, and a wave of tomatoes could mean days of canning in a row, the kitchen hot and steam-filled and fragrant with the particular complex smell of tomatoes being processed. The discipline of the canning schedule, maintained against the pressure of everything else the household required, was one of the more demanding aspects of the August and September kitchen. You canned when the produce was ready, not when it was convenient. The garden's calendar was not your calendar, it was its own, and you adjusted to it. The women's clubs and civic organisations that existed before the war became, in the wartime years, the administrative infrastructure of a civilian defence and support effort that would have been impossible to organise from scratch. The parent-teacher associations, the church women's groups, the garden clubs, the neighbourhood improvement associations, the Red Cross chapters, all of these had pre-existing organisational structures, officer hierarchies, meeting procedures, communication networks, and institutional memory. When the war created demands that these structures could serve, the service was available because the structure was already there. This is worth dwelling on, because the temptation is to describe the wartime mobilization of women's civic organizations as if it were a response to the war, an emergency arising. In fact, It was the activation of something that already existed. The women who organised the scrap drives and the bond campaigns and the Victory Garden advice programmes in 1942 and 1943 had been organising things in their communities for years, sometimes decades, through exactly these organisational channels. The content of the effort was new, the organisational capacity was not. The Church Women's Group, in particular, was a form of community organisation whose importance in this period is difficult to overstate and easy to overlook. The Church provided a pre-existing community of people who knew each other across family and economic lines, who had structures of regular meeting and communication, and who had a shared framework of obligation and care toward the community's members. The wartime activities organised through Church Women's Groups, the sewing circles that produced garments for relief organisations, the food drives that provided for families in temporary need, the visiting programmes that checked on the isolated and the elderly and the families of servicemen, drew on exactly this pre-existing infrastructure. The Extension Service agent, the county agent, sometimes a home demonstration agent, employed by the state land-grant college system to bring agricultural and domestic science knowledge to rural and semi-rural households, was another figure whose importance in this period is underappreciated. Extension agents, many of them women in the home demonstration division, travelled through their counties providing practical instruction on canning, on Victory Garden management, on wartime cooking and food preservation, on nutrition under rationing. They ran demonstrations in community halls and church basements, and sometimes in individual homes, showing women the specific techniques and the specific science that made the difference between safe, high-quality preserved food and the alternatives. The Extension Service's contribution to the safety of home canning during the war years was direct and measurable. The detailed guidance they provided on pressure canning of low-acid vegetables, the specific times and pressures required, the importance of jar and lid integrity, the signs of seal failure, reached millions of households through the Extension network and contributed directly to the absence of a major foodborne illness crisis during a period when home canning was being done on an unprecedented scale by people who had not necessarily done it before. This is public health as practical education, delivered through community channels by people with genuine expertise in the service of a genuine need. It is a model of knowledge transfer that worked in the specific historical conditions of the 1940s, because the organisational infrastructure existed to carry the knowledge and because the recipients were genuinely motivated to receive it. The Neighbourhood Women's Information Network, less formal than the Extension Service and more immediate in its operation, was the horizontal complement to the Extension Service's vertical transmission. Where the Extension Service brought expert knowledge down to the household level, the Neighbourhood Network spread practical intelligence laterally across households at the same level. What worked and what didn't? Which gardening technique produced better results in this neighbourhood's particular soil? Which substitution actually tasted good and which only seemed like it should in theory? Which grocer was worth going to this week, and which was out of what you needed? This lateral knowledge transfer was efficient in ways that the Extension Service could not be, because it operated continuously in real time through the ordinary daily conversations of women who were running the same kind of operation under the same local conditions. The advice from the Extension agent was general. It had to be general to serve a wide range of conditions. The advice from the woman next door was particular, specific to the same neighbourhood's soil and climate and grocery situation, and it was available constantly rather than at scheduled extension meetings. There is a concept in organisational theory, communities of practice, that describes the informal learning that happens when people engaged in the same kind of work are in regular contact with each other, sharing solutions and approaches and the specific intelligence that can only come from doing the thing rather than studying it. The Neighbourhood Women's Network of the 1940s was a community of practice in exactly this sense, and it was effective for exactly the reasons that the theory suggests it should be effective. The learning was continuous, it was grounded in actual practice, it was immediately applicable to real conditions, and it was transmitted through trusted personal relationships rather than impersonal institutional channels. The trust element deserves emphasis. The advice from the woman next door carried weight that the advice from an institution could not quite carry, not because the institutional advice was less technically correct, but because the neighbour had demonstrated her competence in conditions you could observe directly. You'd seen her garden, you had eaten something from her table, you knew that her canning shelf was full, and that her children were healthy, and that her household was managing. The advice she offered came with that demonstrated track record, and the track record made the advice credible in a way that a pamphlet from the USDA, however technically accurate, could not quite replicate. One more aspect of the neighbourhood community in this period that I want to address because it tends to be overlooked: the care of the elderly and the fragile. The neighbourhood was not composed only of women managing young families. It also contained older people, the generation that had been young adults in the First World War, now in their 60s and 70s, living alone or with younger family members or with each other, their physical mobility and their practical capacity for managing daily life ranging widely. It contained people with chronic illness or disability. It contained people whose circumstances made the war's demands particularly difficult. The widow who had no one to help her with the heavier physical work of the household. The elderly couple whose children were both in service and who were managing on fixed income with no one nearby to help. The neighbourhood's care for these members was not organised by any official programme in most cases. It was the organic expression of the mutual obligation that formed the substance of neighbourhood life. The woman who happened to be going to the grocery store checked whether her elderly neighbour needed anything picked up. The woman who was canning asked whether the widow down the street wanted to use the pressure canner when she was done with it, since pressure canners were expensive and not every household had one. The woman who had surplus from her victory garden brought some to the household that had not planted one because the garden's owner was in poor health. These small acts of care, multiplied across a neighbourhood and maintained over years, were the texture of what community actually meant in practice. Not the abstract idea of community, the specific daily, non-heroic act of being someone your neighbour could count on. This is what the 1940s neighbourhood, at its best, was. The mechanics of the letter system deserve more attention than I've given them, because the letter, the actual physical letter, written and received and reread and stored in the drawer, was the primary technology of intimate connection across the distance that the war created, and its limitations and possibilities shaped the emotional experience of the wartime household in specific and important ways. The woman at home wrote at the kitchen table, very often in the late evening when the children were asleep and the house was quiet. The conditions of letter writing were the same as the conditions of the mending basket, the good lamp, the quiet, the particular freedom of the hours after the day's demand had been met. But writing a letter was a different kind of activity than mending. It was an act of reaching across a distance toward a specific person, an attempt to make present through words something that was physically absent. What do you say in such a letter? This is not a rhetorical question. The women who wrote these letters faced a genuine problem of what to include and what to leave out, and the problem was not simple. The censorship that applied to letters from overseas also applied, in the form of self-censorship, to letters going overseas. You did not write anything that might give military intelligence to a censor, or, worse, to the enemy if the letter were intercepted. You did not write things that would increase his anxiety when he was in a position where anxiety was already a constant companion. You did not write things that would make him feel guilty about being gone when the being gone was not his choice, and the guilt would serve no one. At the same time, you wrote honestly enough that the letter felt real, that it communicated the actual life being lived, not a sanitized version of it that would feel strange and hollow. The letter that said only cheerful things, that presented a household coping perfectly with no difficulty and no shadow, would be as troubling in its way as a letter full of complaint and fear. He knew the household, he knew you. A letter that bore no resemblance to the life he had left would tell him something he did not want to know. So you navigated. You wrote about the children honestly, including their difficulties as well as their charm. You wrote about the victory garden with specificity and the particularity of close attention, because you knew he would be interested in the specific. Not the garden is doing well, but the Roma tomatoes are finally turning, and I think we will have enough to do at least 30 quarts. The brandy wines are slower, but I think worth the wait. This kind of specificity was itself a form of intimacy. It said, I know what matters to you, and I am paying attention to it on your behalf. You wrote about the neighbourhood, the familiar cast of characters, the ongoing small dramas of daily life. The neighbour whose husband had received a promotion, the church committee that was feuding about the details of the harvest social, the dog from down the street that had gotten into the victory garden again. These were the details of the ordinary life he had left, and they were the tissue of normalcy that connected him, across the distance, to the world he was fighting to return to. The intimacy of the wartime letter, the compressed, careful, precisely navigated intimacy of it, was a specific art form that millions of American women developed during the war years. Not a literary art form in the elevated sense, a human one. The art of communication under conditions of constraint, which required you to know very precisely what you were trying to say, and to say it in the space available with the materials permitted by the circumstances. The letters they received in return were filtered through the same constraints, plus the military censorship, plus the fact that he was writing from a context she could not fully imagine, and about which he was not permitted to be specific. Reading between the lines of a censored V-mail letter is itself a skill that wartime wives developed from necessity. The letter that mentioned the heat suggested a Pacific theatre. The letter that mentioned mud in the autumn months suggested Europe. The letter that asked in specific detail about the children's homework and the church services and the specific houseplants on the windowsill, the letter that went out of its way to be domestic, to reach toward the small particulars of home, was the letter of a man who needed right now to hold in his mind the specific texture of the life he had left. She understood that. She answered it in kind. She brought the small particulars into her letter because they were what he needed, and she knew what he needed because she knew him, and she knew him because they had built a life together that was full of the specific and the ordinary and the near, and that fullness was both what he was missing and what he was fighting to return to. This mutual, careful, constrained communication across a vast distance, maintained for years without physical proximity, without tone, a voice, without the hundreds of nonverbal signals that normally constitute the full dimension of a relationship. This was a test of something, of whether the connection was real enough and specific enough and deep enough to survive the translation into words alone, sent at intervals, arriving at intervals containing what they could and omitting what they must. Most marriages survived it. Some did not. The ones that did came through it with a particular quality of hard-won intimacy. The knowledge, proven under difficult conditions, that this person was someone you could reach across an impossible distance and still find present, still recognizable, still there. The children's relationship with the absent father was managed primarily by the mother, and this management deserves its own examination. A father overseas was simultaneously present and absent in the lives of his children, and the degree of presence or absence was, to a significant extent, the mother's construction. She could keep him present, in conversation, in the photographs on the sideboard, in the letters read aloud, in the deliberate connection of the children's daily activities to what she knew he would be interested in, or she could let him fade into the abstract category of the absent, the person who used to be here and is not now and will someday be back. Most mothers, by all evidence, worked to keep him present. The letters were shared with the children in age-appropriate ways. The children were encouraged to draw pictures or write messages to be included in the next letter home. The daily activities were framed, when possible, in terms of what Daddy would think about this, what Daddy would say, what they could tell Daddy when he came home. This was not sentiment. It was practical parenting under difficult conditions. The management of children's relationship with an absent parent, maintaining the connection across the absence so that the return would not be the arrival of a stranger. It was also, for the woman managing it, a way of maintaining her own connection to the person she was keeping present for the children. Speaking his name, calling him into the family's daily conversation, refusing to let the absence become erasure, this was maintenance of the relationship for herself as much as for the children, even if it looked from the outside like wholly selfless parenting. The specific and awful weight of the gold star deserves more than I have yet given it. The process by which a blue star flag became a gold star flag began with a telegram. The Western Union telegraph boy at the door. This image is so encoded in the cultural memory of the period that it has become nearly a cliché, but the reason it has become a cliché is that it happened, tens of thousands of times, and the women who answered those doorbells did so with the particular dread of someone who knew what the boy on the porch might be carrying. The telegram itself was brief. The language was official and impersonal. We regret to inform you, your husband, your son, your brother, in the service of his country. The official language performed its function, conveying the essential information with the brevity and formality that the military's notification system required, and left everything else, the entire human weight of what that information meant, to the person who received it. She received it alone, very often, in the middle of the day with the children at school and the house quiet, or in the evening when the children were home, and the management of her response, the management of what appeared on her face and in her voice, and in the 30 seconds between opening the door and sending the telegraph boy away and closing the door, was the kind of management that required a depth of self-possession that is difficult to describe to someone who has not been required to exercise it. What happened in the minutes and hours after the telegram is not something that the historical record tends to capture directly. There are accounts, the memoirs, the letters written to sisters and mothers, the later interviews done by historians who recognise that this experience needed its documentation. What they show, across the variety of individual accounts, is something that falls outside the categories available for it. Not simply grief, though grief was there. Not simply shock, something more total. The rearrangement of everything, the future becoming a different shape, the ordinary world in which you had been standing 30 minutes ago having become a different world that would require learning from the beginning. And then the children came home from school. The management of that moment, the management of what to say and when and in what terms and with what emotional tenor to a 7-year-old and a 9-year-old who arrived at the door expecting the ordinary afternoon, is the specific kind of impossible that this war gave to these women over and over across the country, in 40-year-old houses with victory gardens out back, and ration books on the kitchen table, and the radio still playing in the front room. There is a specific discipline in the pedagogy of making do that the 1940s household transmitted to its children, and I want to spend time on it because its consequences extended well beyond the war years. The child growing up in a household managed by a competent 1940s housewife was being educated in something that the formal school system was not teaching, or at least not teaching in the same way. They were being educated in the relationship between work and result, in the connection between the effort expended and the outcome produced, in the specific and embodied knowledge that the things you need, the food on the table, the warmth in the house, the clothing on your back, do not arrive through magic but through the daily sustained effort of real people doing real things. This education happened through observation and participation rather than instruction. The child who watched her mother plan the week's meals from the ration book's remaining stamps was absorbing something about constraint and creativity and the management of limited resources that no classroom lesson could have produced as vividly. The child who helped with the victory garden, digging, planting, watering, weeding, was learning the relationship between attention and productivity, between the sustained care that a garden requires and the tomatoes that appear on the table in October. The mending was often a shared activity. Girls especially were taught to sew and to darn and to patch from an early age, not as a hobby or a feminine accomplishment in the Victorian sense, but as a practical skill with an immediate and obvious application. The child who could mend her own clothing had one less demand on her mother's time and one more competence of her own. The transmission of these skills was not always a formal lesson. It happened alongside the ordinary flow of the household's work. The child sitting near the mother at the mending basket, watching, asking questions, trying, failing, trying again, gradually acquiring the skill through the same mechanism that all practical knowledge is actually acquired. The child who grew up in this household learned something else too, that is harder to name but equally important. They learned that competence is ordinary, that doing difficult things well is not heroic or exceptional but simply what is required, and that the requirement is not a complaint, it is just the condition. The mother who made the meatloaf from the available ingredients and the beans she had put up in August, and the biscuits from the flour that was running a little low, the mother who did all of this without complaint or self-congratulation, as the ordinary work of an ordinary day, was teaching by example that this is how life works, and that the working is not a diminishment. This is the opposite of the lesson that abundant consumer culture teaches. The lesson of abundance is that difficulty is a problem to be solved by purchasing the solution. The lesson of the 1940s household was that difficulty is the ordinary condition of a life, and that the right response to it is competence and ingenuity, and, where necessary, acceptance. These are different relationships with the world, and they produce different people. The children who absorbed the 1940s household's lessons tended to be, by the accounts of those who knew them, practically capable in ways that subsequent generations sometimes found surprising. They knew how to cook from scratch. They knew how to repair rather than replace. They knew how to manage money in the specific sense of knowing how to make limited money cover necessary expenses. They had a tolerance for constraint that was not passive, not the tolerance of someone who has given up, but active, the tolerance of someone who knows how to work inside limits because they have always worked inside limits. Many of them also carried, less usefully, some of the specific anxieties of the wartime childhood. The depression about wasting food that could tilt into an uncomfortable intensity. The difficulty with abundance. The specific unease of a well-stocked pantry or a full refrigerator that someone who grew up with the scrap jar and the ration book might not quite be able to shake even when the conditions that had produced it were long gone. The persistent tendency to plan for the worst, to save rather than spend, to assume that the shortage would return, which it eventually always does, though usually in a different form. The child who grew up in the 1940s household brought those lessons forward into adult life, modified by the specific conditions of the post-war prosperity that the 1950s delivered. The tension between the wartime formation, the deep-seated habits of management and restraint, and the post-war abundance, the suddenly full stores, the new appliances, the expanding middle-class consumer culture, is one of the defining tensions of the generation that came of age in the 1950s. They had been formed by one world and were living in another, and the management of that discontinuity was its own kind of work. I want to say something about what it cost the women who were the emotional centres of these households. Not to make this into tragedy, it was not primarily a tragic story, but to be honest about the specific toll of a particular kind of sustained responsibility. Being the emotional centre of a household means, among other things, that you do not fully have the right to your own emotional weather. You can be tired, but you cannot show the children how tired you are. You can be frightened, but you must calibrate how much of the fear is appropriate to express and in what form and to what audience. You can be angry about the situation you're in. Angry at the war, angry at the absence, angry at the specific unfairness of having had your life reorganized by external forces you did not choose. But the expression of that anger must be managed, because unmanaged anger in the emotional center of a household destabilizes the household, and the household's stability is the first requirement. This management has a cost. The cost is accumulative. Any emotion that is consistently managed rather than expressed does not disappear. It becomes compressed, denser, harder to handle as the compression continues. The women who managed this best were not the ones who had no emotional weather. They were the ones who had found the outlets. The early morning's private time, the conversation with the neighbour over the fence, the letter written to her sister that said what she could not say to anyone who needed her to be steady, the church prayer that was at least partly a renegotiation with whatever was in charge of making things this hard. The ones who managed less well were often the ones who had fewer of these outlets, who were more isolated, more alone in the specific sense of having no one with whom the management could be safely relaxed. The women whose circumstance made the emotional regulation constant and complete, with no break in it anywhere, were the ones most likely to break themselves. The support structures of the neighbourhood community, the church, the women's organisations, they were not just practical, they were therapeutic in the most basic sense. They provided the human contact and the understood context that made the ongoing management of an impossible situation possible to continue. The radio programs of the 1940s deserve a more serious treatment than they sometimes get, because they were not simply entertainment. They were, in an era without television and with extremely limited screen media of any kind, the primary cultural content of the household's life, and their character and content shaped the texture of the 1940s evening in ways that had both individual and collective dimensions. The programs themselves ranged across a remarkable variety of forms. The comedy programs, Jack Benny, Bob Hope, Fibber McGee and Molly, operated in a register of gentle, familiar humour that did not challenge and did not disturb, and was genuinely funny in the particular way that comedy is funny when it is working correctly. When it recognises something true about ordinary life and presents it at just the right angle to make you laugh at the recognition, these programs were listened to by entire families, were discussed the next day with neighbours, were shared reference points for a culture that did not yet have the fragmentation of media choice that later decades would bring. The dramatic programs, the mystery serials, the adventure stories, the soap operas that ran in the afternoon, operated at a different register, engaging the imagination more actively in the specific way that audio drama requires. Without images, the listener's imagination supplied the visuals, which meant that the world of a radio drama was, in a sense, precisely as real and precisely as detailed as the individual listener's imagination made it. The radio drama required active listening in a way that later visual media would not. You had to construct the scene from the audio cues provided, and the construction was both imaginative effort and imaginative pleasure. The news programmes, Edward R. Murrow from London, the Evening War reports, the network summaries, were listened to with a different kind of attention entirely. Not the relaxed pleasure of the comedy programme or the imaginative engagement of the drama. The news was listened to with the full directed concentration of a person for whom the events being reported had direct personal stakes. The war news was your news. The campaign being described was the campaign where your husband's unit was operating, or might be operating, or had been operating last month when you got the last letter. The names and the numbers were not abstract to you. They were the coordinates of your own fear. The ritual of gathering around the radio for the evening news was one of the most consistent elements of wartime household life across regions and economic levels. Not a ceremony exactly. It did not require preparation or coordination. But a consistent practice, a shared attention, a moment when the family's private world and the world's larger reality were in explicit contact. The children old enough to understand the significance listened. The younger children were sometimes taken out of the room, not from dishonesty, but from the practical wisdom that not everything that was true was appropriate for every audience at every age. After the news, the distance between what had just been reported and the ordinary objects of the front room, the mending basket, the worn sofa, the radio itself now playing music after the news programme had ended, could feel stark in a way that required something. Some response, not necessarily a verbal one, sometimes just the resumption of the mending, the return to the specific and immediate task as a way of inhabiting the present, rather than remaining in the enormous abstract of the war. The music that played in the evenings on the commercial stations was the music of the era in the most complete sense. Glenn Miller's In the Mood, the Andrews Sisters harmonising on Boogie Woogie Bugle Boy, Bing Crosby's warm baritone delivering I'll Be Home for Christmas in the December of 1943 when it was released, and when the promise embedded in the lyric was not certain, and the listener knew it was not certain, and the longing in the song was the listener's own longing heard back in a form that made it bearable. The power of that particular song in that particular moment is something worth sitting with. A song that made a promise, I'll be home for Christmas, you can count on me, while simultaneously acknowledging in its final line that the promise might be kept only in dream, not in reality, only if only in my dreams. The song was entirely honest about the uncertainty it was wrapping in the language of reassurance, and the women who listened to it in the evenings of 1943 heard both things simultaneously, the promise and the qualification. They held both at once, the way you hold a difficult truth with both hands when you cannot set it down. This capacity, to hold irresolution, to live inside uncertainty without demanding its premature resolution, was one of the less discussed capabilities that the wartime household required and that its women developed. The tolerance of not knowing, the ability to maintain the daily functioning of a life while the most fundamental question of that life remained unanswered. When will he come home? Will he come home? The uncertainty was not temporary. It was the condition, for years, and the women inside it had to find a way to be functional inside an open question, rather than waiting for the question to close before continuing to live. This is harder than it sounds, and I do not want to make it sound easy. The tolerance of uncertainty is not a natural condition for most people. We are organisms built for resolution, for the closing of open loops, for the satisfaction of knowing. The wartime household's women were required to develop a capacity for sustained irresolution that was genuinely against the grain of ordinary human comfort, and most of them did develop it, and the development had consequences for how they inhabited the rest of their lives. Some of those consequences were useful. The woman who has lived inside genuine uncertainty for 4 years develops a specific equanimity about the smaller uncertainties of ordinary life. The car that is uncertain to start, the grocery situation that may or may not have what she needs, the child's health that may or may not resolve quickly. Having faced the large and genuine uncertainty, the smaller ones are correctly sized. Some of those consequences were more complex. The tolerance for irresolution that the war required could become a habit, a tendency to continue tolerating conditions that actually could be resolved, to accept as fixed what was in fact changeable. The woman who had learned to not demand resolution when resolution was impossible might sometimes fail to demand it when it was possible and appropriate. But mostly the capacity was simply that, a capacity. an earned and hard-won ability to function inside the incomplete, to keep going without knowing where you were going, to hold the household and the children and the daily life in shape, while the largest question remained open. This is what the evenings held, in the mending basket and the radio's music, and the letter on the table not yet answered. The post-war transition deserves considerably more attention than it typically receives in accounts of the 1940s homefront, because it was not simply the good ending of a difficult story. It was a new chapter with its own complications, and those complications bear directly on what the 1940s housewife's experience ultimately meant and how it was or was not carried forward. By the fall of 1945, the returning veterans were coming home in large numbers, and the America they returned to was in the midst of an extraordinary economic expansion that would define the following decade. The war industries were converting to consumer goods production. The GE Bill was making home ownership and higher education accessible to a generation of working-class men who had never expected either. The suburbs were being built at a scale and a pace that had no historical precedent in American residential history. Levittown began in 1947. By 1950, the suburban housing development was the dominant model for American middle-class residential life. The new suburban house was different from the wartime house in ways that were deliberately designed to appeal to the women who would be moving into it. Modern kitchen appliances, automatic washing machines replacing the wringer washer, refrigerators large enough to make the twice-weekly ice delivery unnecessary. The formica and the linoleum and the convenience of push-button cooking, everything that had been difficult and labour-intensive in the 1940s, house was being engineered out of existence by an appliance industry that understood that housewives were the primary decision-makers for household purchases, and that convenience was what they most wanted. This was not wrong. Convenience was genuinely desirable, and the women who had managed wringer washers and coal furnaces and the daily physical labour of a pre-modern household were not nostalgic for those experiences. They wanted the automatic washer, they wanted the refrigerator, they wanted the gas range with the reliable automatic ignition, rather than the pilot light that went out and needed relighting. But the convenience came packaged with a cultural message that was more complicated. The advertising and the magazine editorial content of the late 1940s and early 1950s was in the business of telling women that the new household technology made their role more fulfilling rather than simply less labour-intensive. That the woman who used the new appliances was a modern, sophisticated household manager rather than a labourer, and that the sophistication was expressed through consumption and management of the new technology rather than through the older kinds of competence that the wartime household had developed. This was, in significant part, a reconstruction of what it meant to be competent in the domestic sphere. The competence of the wartime housewife, the practical, skill-intensive, resource-managing competence of the ration book and the pressure canner, was being replaced, in the cultural messaging of the post-war decade, by a different competence, the competence of selecting the right appliance, of managing the right product, of producing the right suburban domestic life. The women who had developed and exercised the wartime skills found that those skills were being gently but consistently devalued in the new cultural environment, not suppressed exactly, simply superseded, made irrelevant by the context of abundance and the push toward consumption as the expression of domestic competence. The woman who made her own bread from scratch when sliced commercial bread was available in every grocery store was making a choice that the cultural scripts of 1951 could only read as inefficiency or eccentricity, even though the bread she made was better. This is the specific cultural amnesia I was describing earlier. The wartime skills did not go away. They went underground. They were practiced by the women who had them, maintained in the texture of their daily lives even when the cultural context no longer recognized their value, and transmitted to children and grandchildren in the domestic equivalent of an oral tradition, passed in kitchens and gardens and sewing rooms and the informal apprenticeships of daily household life. The women who kept those skills were not making a political statement. They were not refusing the post-war convenience as a matter of principle. Most of them used the automatic washer and the electric refrigerator with genuine gratitude. They just also kept the victory garden and the canning operation and the scratch cooking and the mending basket, because those things were not merely practical skills. They were, by this point, part of how they understood their own competence and their own identity. There is something here about what it means to be genuinely good at something. The woman who had spent the war years developing real skill in the management of a household under constraint was not going to simply stop being good at it, because the constraint had been removed. The goodness was in her now. It was part of how she understood herself. The skill and the self were not separable in the way that a tool and its user are separable. The pressure to forget, to perform the new competence rather than the old one, must have been, for some of these women, a specific kind of disorientation. To be required to present oneself in a mode that did not fully acknowledge what one actually knew and could do. To have the most demanding and most developed parts of one's capability treated as irrelevant or obsolete. To be told implicitly that the new abundance had made the management of scarcity into a nostalgic irrelevance, rather than a form of genuine knowledge worth maintaining. The feminist movement that gathered force in the 1960s was, among other things, the belated cultural recognition that something real had been lost in this post-war recalibration. The argument that domestic labour was work, real, skilled, economically valuable work, was in many ways the argument that should have been made in 1945 when the war had made the value of that work temporarily visible, and then a culture in a hurry to return to normalcy had covered it back over again. The women of the 1940s home front were not, by and large, part of the 1960s women's movement. Many of them were sceptical of it. Some of them had spent the better part of their adult lives in the domestic sphere and were not eager to see it characterized as a trap or a diminishment. Some of them, perhaps, recognized in the feminist critique something close to the truth of their experience and found the recognition complicated rather than simple. What they had done was not nothing. It was extraordinary. It deserved recognition on its own terms, not as a preliminary to something else, not as the wrong kind of life that women should have been freed from sooner. It deserved to be seen clearly as the specific and demanding and competent thing it was, and in the seeing, to carry its full weight. There is a question underneath everything I have been saying in this story, and I want to name it directly. It is, what do we do with this now? Not as a political prescription, not as a practical guide to surviving a future that might look like the past. As a question of understanding, of what it means to know this history, to take it seriously, to let it sit in us with its full weight and complexity. I keep thinking about the word competence, about what it means to be genuinely competent at something difficult, about the specific relationship that genuine competence creates between a person and their work, the way it grounds you, centers you, gives you a stable sense of what you can and cannot do that is harder to disturb than the esteem that comes from being told you are capable without having specifically demonstrated it. The 1940s, housewife's competence was tested constantly, every day, in the kitchen and the garden and the neighbourhood, and the management of children and the reading of letters and the maintenance of a household's emotional centre. It was required, and it was measured against real outcomes, and it was refined by what worked and what didn't. This is a different kind of knowing than any that can be acquired in the absence of the requirement to use it. I think about my own life and what I am actually good at, in the specific and proven sense. The things I have done often enough, and under enough varying conditions to know that my competence with them is real. Not many things in most people's lives. We tend to specialise in ways that the 1940s household did not permit. We are competent in our professional domains and modestly capable in a few domestic ones, and relatively helpless in a surprising number of others that the household systems handle without our needing to understand them. There is nothing inherently wrong with this specialisation. It is the natural consequence of a division of labour that has made everyone wealthier and more productive, and more able to access a greater variety of goods and services than any generalist household could produce for itself. The argument against specialisation is not a practical argument. It is a different kind of argument. It is about what the knowledge does to you, not what it produces, but what it makes of the person who holds it. There is something about knowing how to do a hard and necessary thing, something about the relationship between you and the world that the knowledge creates, that is different from the relationship you have with a world in which the hard and necessary things are handled by others. I'm not sure I can fully articulate what that difference is. It has something to do with agency, something to do with the degree to which you feel yourself to be genuinely inside your own life rather than managing it from a position of comfortable distance. Something to do with the specific, embodied confidence that comes from having done the thing rather than having arranged for it to be done. The 1940s housewife was inside her own life in a way that the conditions of that life required, and that produced, I think, a quality of presence in the daily that is harder to locate in lives managed at greater distance from their material conditions. She knew where her food came from because she had grown some of it. She knew what her household required because she had personally managed every dimension of that requirement. She knew what she could do because she had been doing it daily under conditions that tested it constantly. This knowing, this grounded, proven, specific knowing, is one of the things that the abundance of the post-war decades made less urgently necessary, and that we have been slowly losing since, not as a dramatic catastrophe, but as a gradual drift away from the kind of knowledge that the body holds. I am not making an argument for deprivation. I am making an argument for attention, for the kind of relationship with the material conditions of our own lives that the 1940s housewife, out of necessity, maintained. For the specific intelligence of someone who knows what is in their pantry and what it costs and how to make it into something, as opposed to the generic capability of someone who can acquire whatever they need, as long as the systems that make acquisition possible are functioning normally. The systems will not always function normally. This is not pessimism. It is the observation that every system humans have built has periods of disruption, and that the people who fare best in those periods are not necessarily the most technologically sophisticated or the most affluent. They are often the people who have maintained, through practice or inheritance or deliberate choice, some of the practical competence that abundance makes optional and crisis makes essential. The 1940s housewife had that competence in full. She had not chosen to develop it under duress. She had been developing it throughout her adult life in the ordinary practice of managing a household, and when the duress arrived, she was ready for it in a way that had nothing to do with heroism and everything to do with the accumulated skill of daily practical life. What she knew, she had earned. What she could do, she had proven. And the proof was visible in every jar of tomatoes on the canning shelf, in every meal made from the ration book's remaining stamps, in every child fed and healthy and going to school in clean clothes in the morning, in every letter written at the kitchen table late at night, carefully calibrating what to say and what to leave out, maintaining the connection across an impossible distance, holding the household together from the inside while the world outside did its difficult and dangerous work. That is the story, not the symbol, the actual thing. The woman who was good at something very difficult, who did it every day, and who went to bed tired and got up and did it again. I want to carry that with me. I think you might too. The substitution recipes that circulated during the war years reveal, in their specificity, exactly how deep the knowledge went and how creative the solutions were required to be. Consider the problem of eggs. Eggs were not directly rationed. They were not in the OPA's formal rationing system, but they were genuinely scarce in many urban areas because the production and distribution system was under considerable strain. Farm families who raised their own chickens had eggs reliably. Urban families did not, and the price of eggs on the commercial market fluctuated with a volatility that made them effectively rationed by cost even when they were nominally available. The egg substitutes that appeared in wartime recipes were several. Commercial egg substitutes, made primarily from dried whole egg or dried egg white powder, were available but not universally appealing. They produced baked goods with a slightly different texture and a slightly flat flavour that experienced bakers noticed immediately. Flax seeds soaked in water, which produce a gel that binds and traps air in the way an egg does, were used by some cooks and were genuinely effective in many applications. In certain baked goods, banana bread, dense fruit cakes, carrot cake, the egg could be omitted entirely or replaced with an extra tablespoon of oil or a few ounces of applesauce with no significant loss of quality. The women who worked through these substitutions systematically, who tested each one in the recipes their families relied on, and noted which worked and which didn't, and in what proportions, were doing applied food science. Not under that name, not in that frame, but in substance. They were learning the function of each ingredient in the larger system of a recipe, learning to identify which functions were essential to the outcome and which were not, learning which ingredients could substitute for which functions and in what quantities. This is the kind of knowledge that professional recipe developers and food scientists acquire through training and deliberate study. The 1940s housewife acquired it through the necessity of daily practice under constraint, and the knowledge she developed was in many respects just as deep and just as reliable, within the domain of her household's specific recipes and her family's specific preferences, as the professional food scientist's more formal version. The sugar problem was even more complex than the egg problem, because sugar performs multiple functions in baked goods simultaneously. It sweetens, obviously. But it also contributes to browning, the caramelization and Maillard reactions that produce the golden crust on a baked good are partly driven by sugar. It contributes to moisture retention. Sugar is hygroscopic, meaning it attracts and holds water, which keeps baked goods soft after baking, and it contributes to texture. The interaction between sugar, fat, and flour in a creamed batter produces the particular tender crumb of a well-made cake in ways that no substitute entirely replicates. Reducing sugar in a recipe was therefore not simply a matter of using less of it and getting a less sweet result. It changed the entire character of the baked good. The browning was different, the moisture was different, the texture was different. Working around sugar rationing in baking required understanding these functions well enough to compensate for them individually, to get the browning with molasses or brown sugar used sparingly, to get the moisture retention with a bit of extra fat or a reduction in baking time, to compensate for the texture change with a different ratio of ingredients. The women who did this successfully were doing it intuitively, from accumulated experience, but the intelligence underlying the intuition was real and sound. They were correct about how the functions worked, even if they did not have the scientific vocabulary to describe them. The proof was in the cake. The texture was right, the browning was adequate, the result was recognizable and good. This applied intelligence in the kitchen, the ability to diagnose why something was not working and identify the correct intervention, is the mark of genuine competence, as opposed to the mere ability to follow a recipe. Following a recipe requires literacy and attention. Real cooking competence requires the understanding of why each step exists and what each ingredient does, so that when the recipe cannot be followed exactly, the cook knows how to adapt it to the conditions that actually exist. The 1940s housewife had this competence, developed through years of practice, refined by the constraints that made following recipes impossible and adaptation necessary. It is one of the genuine intellectual achievements of the domestic life of this period, and it deserves its credit. The community-level dimension of wartime cooking knowledge is also worth tracing. The recipes that worked, the specific adaptation that succeeded, the substitution that produced genuinely good results, spread through the neighborhood networks with the speed that useful practical knowledge always travels when people are sharing conditions and problems. The potluck dinner, the church social, the neighborhood women's gathering, these were all venues where dishes made from wartime ingredients were tasted and evaluated, and the successful ones were requested, explained, written out on a card and handed over. This recipe sharing was not trivial. It was the mechanism by which successful individual experimentation became collective knowledge, accessible to everyone in the network rather than only to the woman who had stumbled upon the solution. The community cookbook, a staple of church women's groups and civic organizations in this period, was one formal expression of this process. The recipes collected, tested, organized, and published for the benefit of the broader community. These cookbooks are historical documents of considerable interest. They show in their ingredient lists and their techniques, and their evident assumptions about what the cook would and would not need to be told, the specific knowledge of a specific community at a specific moment. The wartime editions of community cookbooks show the substitutions and the management techniques, and the specific solutions to the specific problems of the ration book as they were understood in that community. They are the written record of a practical intelligence being collectively exercised. There is something worth saying about the relationship between the wartime kitchen and the larger question of food culture in America. The American food culture of the mid-20th century, the casseroles and the jello salads, and the processed convenience foods that defined middle-class cooking from roughly 1950 through 1970, is often criticized, and the criticism has some justice. The post-war embrace of processed and convenience foods represented in part a reaction against the demands of the wartime kitchen, an attraction to the easiness of the can opener and the frozen meal as an alternative to the sustained effort of scratch cooking under constraint. But there is another way to read it. The housewife who bought the can of Campbell's tomato soup in 1952 rather than making it from scratch was not abandoning competence. She was making a rational allocation of her limited time and energy. She had spent 4 years making things from scratch out of necessity. She now had the option not to, and she took it. The competence did not disappear. It was held in reserve, available when necessary, while the everyday cooking was simplified by the infrastructure that post-war prosperity had made available. The women who maintained scratch cooking through the post-war decades alongside the use of convenience foods were making a different calculation, and their calculation was also rational. The scratch-cooked food was better, the cost savings were real, the satisfaction of the making was genuine. But neither calculation was wrong. They reflected different assessments of the same trade-off, made by different people with different resources and preferences and histories. What is worth noting, looking at it from this distance, is that both calculations assumed the continued existence of the competence as a baseline. The post-war housewife who bought the canned soup had the option of making the soup from scratch if she chose. She had the knowledge, the equipment, and the skill. The convenience food was a choice, not a necessity. The option remained open. The question of whether the option remains open in the same way for people who have not grown up inside that knowledge, who have not seen it practiced, who would need to look it up in a cookbook rather than draw on years of embedded learning, that is a different question, and the answer is more complicated. There is one more dimension of the 1940s household that I want to give you before we are finished, and it is one that tends to disappear when the story is told from inside the house rather than from the level of the street. The 1940s American neighborhood was a system. I do not mean that as an abstraction. I mean it in the specific operational sense, the way a machine is a system, or the way a healthy body is a system, or the way a well-organized supply chain is a system. The neighborhood had inputs and outputs. It had people who held information and people who distributed it. It had a daily rhythm that everyone on the street both depended on and contributed to, and when any part of it was disrupted, the rest of the system adjusted to compensate. The women of those households were the system's primary operators, not its only members, but the ones who were present for the full operating day, day after day, for the full duration of the war. Think about what the street actually looked like on a Tuesday morning in 1943. The Iceman came on Tuesdays and Fridays. His truck moved slowly down the block and the women who needed ice had signs in their windows. A square card printed with numbers on all four sides indicating how many pounds were wanted, turned so the correct number faced outward. The Iceman read the signs and cut the ice accordingly. You did not call ahead. You did not make an appointment. You put the card in the window and the system delivered. The Iceman knew every household on his route. He knew who was reliable, who always forgot the card, who would need help getting the block into the box because the husband was overseas and the woman was managing alone. He was a node in the neighborhood's information network as much as he was a delivery service. The milkman came every morning before most households were awake. He knew from the empty bottles on the step what the household had used. He knew, over time, when the usual pattern changed, when 3 empty bottles appeared on the step instead of 2, which meant a visitor was in the house, or when no empties appeared at all, which sometimes meant something worth noting. He was not a welfare check, but he was a presence, a daily contact point, one of the threads in the neighborhood's fabric. The delivery of the mail, the morning paper, the bread man on his route, the calls through screen doors between neighbors in the late morning when the children were at school, and the work of the house was at a particular point in its rhythm. These were not casual social exchanges, though they were social. They were the neighborhood's nervous system sending signals, passing information, checking on the state of things. The women who ran those households were the primary recipients and processors of that information. They knew who on the block had received a telegram in the night because the Western Union boy's bicycle was visible from the kitchen window, and you could not unsee it once you knew what it meant. They knew which family's ration book had run short because the conversation happened in the queue at the grocery store where everyone's business was conducted in proximity whether you intended it or not. They knew who was struggling to manage and who was managing well, and what the neighborhood collectively had and what it needed. This knowledge was not gossip, though gossip is part of how human beings transmit information about one another and should not be dismissed too quickly. This knowledge was operational. It was the intelligence that allowed the neighborhood to function as more than a collection of individual households sealed off from one another's difficulties. It was what made possible the offer of extra eggs when someone's chickens had stopped laying, and the arrangement where one woman's pressure canner was used by 3 households on a rotating schedule because you did not each need your own, and the quiet passing of a cup of sugar over the back fence when the stamps had run out and the next supply was still a week away and there was a child's birthday in the meantime. None of this was organised. There was no committee. no charter, no official structure to any of it. It organized itself out of proximity and necessity, and the specific social intelligence of women who had been paying close attention to one another's conditions for years. I want to be careful not to idealize this. The neighborhood of the 1940s was not a harmonious community free of conflict or resentment, or the ordinary difficulties of human beings living in close proximity to one another. There were feuds. There were people who did not share what they had even when they could. There were women who were difficult neighbors and difficult people, and the fact that they were managing hard circumstances did not make them easy to live alongside. The neighborhood was a human thing, which means it was a complicated thing, but it was functioning. And it was functioning in part because the women who ran those households had developed, over years of daily proximity, the specific knowledge of one another that made collective management possible. Not the deep knowledge of chosen friendship, though some of those friendships existed. The practical knowledge of adjacent lives, what this neighbor needed, what that one had to offer, where the gaps were and who could fill them, and how to ask in a way that did not diminish anyone in the asking. The vocabulary they used for this was not the vocabulary of systems thinking or community management. They called it being neighborly. They called it helping out. They called it what any decent person would do. The language was humble and unassuming, and it understated what was actually happening, which was the coordinated management of collective scarcity by women who had developed, through practice and proximity, a set of skills that no formal training program had taught them and no official recognition had acknowledged. There is a moment I have thought about often since I first came across it in an account of a California neighborhood during the war years. It is an ordinary moment, not dramatic, not commemorated anywhere. A woman on a block in Los Angeles learned in the morning that her neighbor's husband had been wounded in the Pacific. Not killed, wounded. The neighbor did not yet have details. She was waiting for more information and managing the waiting in the company of her 2 children, who were 9 and 6 and knew something was wrong but did not know what. The woman who learned this information went home and cooked dinner for both families. She did not ask. She did not deliberate. She simply made more food than her household needed and carried it across the yard at supper time. She stayed for a while. She left when she could see that what was needed now was the specific quiet of a family, managing its own fear in private. That is the neighborhood operating as a system. That is the specific intelligence of a woman who knows what another woman needs, and how to provide it without making the provision into a statement about need. No organization authorized it. No official channel processed it. The knowledge was local and immediate, and the response was proportionate to the knowledge. Multiply that moment by the number of households on the block. Multiply that block by the number of blocks in the neighborhood. Multiply that neighborhood by the number of neighborhoods in every city and town and rural county in America, where women were managing households alone or near alone while the war continued its work. The aggregate of those moments is the home front, not the posters, not the official campaigns, not the government messaging about sacrifice and duty and the patriotic obligation to plant a garden. The daily, specific, unglamorous intelligence of women who knew their neighborhoods and managed them and kept them functioning through 4 years of shortage and fear and the particular difficulty of not knowing when or how the waiting would end. This is the part of the history that has no natural memorial and no convenient form of commemoration. It cannot be captured in a statue or a plaque or a single date to mark on the calendar. It was distributed and continuous and ordinary, and its ordinariness was precisely what made it essential. The thing that does not break down in an emergency is not usually the dramatic thing. It is usually the thing that has been quietly functioning all along, maintained by people who understood what it required and provided it without ceremony. That was the neighborhood. That was the street. That was the woman in the kitchen who knew which floorboard spoke and which one stayed quiet, who was up before anyone else and knew what the day would require and had been preparing for it since before the light came through. The window above the sink. She held the center, not perfectly, not without cost, not without exhaustion and doubt and the particular loneliness of managing something too large for one person and doing it anyway because there is no one else. But she held it, year after year, every morning, the coffee already on. Thank you so much for watching. If you'd like to see more videos like this, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. It really helps us keep making more content. See you in the next one. Did your grandmother or great-grandmother live through the 1940s home front? Is there something she made or something she said that you still carry with you? I would genuinely love to hear it in the comments.